Moana. It was a hot summer evening, and I had just spent the entire day job hunting. Finding work as a human in a world dominated by werewolves, especially in the midst of the hustle and bustle of the city, wasn't easy. Even though I had a degree in early childhood education, no schools wanted to hire me because I was a human. Werewolf parents were outraged at the thought of a worthless human teaching their children, as if my skills, drive, and education meant nothing. So, I was now limited to service jobs, which were also unfortunately hard to come by because the job market was oversaturated with other humans who were also desperate to pay their bills. If I didn't find a job soon, though, I would lose my apartment. My landlord had already given me a 30-day notice. If I didn't pay my rent and the 3 months of rent that I already owed, by the end of the 30 days, he was going to evict me. At least I still had my boyfriend, Sam. He wasn't extraordinarily well off either, despite being a werewolf, but at least he had a job and could pay his rent. We had been together for 3 years now and had known each other for 5, so maybe it was time to talk about moving in together soon. As I was walking down the packed city street, a thin layer of sweat caked to my forehead from spending the day running from business to business as I tried to find someone who would hire me, I started to realize how hungry I was. I couldn't afford to eat out, but the delicious smells coming from the restaurants I passed began to make my mouth water. One particular restaurant across the street caught my eye, but not because of the smell of food. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes widening. Inside the restaurant, right in the window, was Sam. He wasn't alone. He was with another woman, and they were kissing. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," I said out loud, causing a few passersby to turn their heads and give me weird looks. Sam had told me that he was busy recently, that he had a lot of work. Was this what he was really doing? Cheating on me with some other woman? The fury bubbled up inside of me, and without thinking, I stormed across the street and toward the restaurant window. My stomach turned as I came closer. This woman was gorgeous, basically a supermodel, and that didn't make me feel any better about the situation. Not only was Sam cheating on me, but he was cheating on me with someone who looked like that. She was thin, blonde, and tan with long legs, wearing a skimpy evening dress and high heels. I do get compliments on my face, body, and long red hair, but in that moment, I felt so worthless as I stood there looking at Sam and his mistress. How could he do this to me? I stopped in front of the window. Neither of them even saw me standing there. They were so absorbed in their makeout session. So I banged on the window. Sam and the mystery woman both jumped, their eyes widening when they saw me. I stormed over to the entrance and ran inside, ignoring the strange looks from the restaurant staff and customers, and ran up to where Sam and the woman sat. "How fucking dare you?" I yelled, my hands curled up into fists at my sides. "We've been together for 3 years and you're cheating on me?" The woman looked back and forth between Sam and I with an embarrassed expression on her face as the restaurant fell silent, but Sam's face showed only anger and resentment. Without saying a word, Sam stood and grabbed me by the arm, dragging me out of the restaurant. He was too strong for me to resist, so I stumbled after him and back out into the busy street with tears streaming down my cheeks. "You're making a fool of both of us, Moana," he growled once we were outside. "I'm making a fool of us?" I replied, my voice still raised. "You're making out with another woman in public." Sam merely rolled his eyes and pulled me further away from the door. His werewolf eyes burned a bright orange color, and his face was wrought with anger. "Control your temper," he whispered, pushing me roughly up against the side of the building. "You're just an ordinary human. You should feel lucky that I even entertained you for 3 years." His words stung, and my vision became clouded with tears. "Why her?" I croaked as a sob caught in my throat. Sam, the man who had told me he loved me for 3 years, merely chuckled. "You're useless to me," he snarled. "She's a beta. Her family is incredibly wealthy and powerful, and thanks to her, I'll be starting a new job at WearCorp next week." WearCorp was the biggest corporation in the world. Not only did they control all of the banks, but they also developed the newest and most widely used cryptocurrency of the 21st century, Wcoin. I never used it. Humans weren't allowed to, but it made a lot of werewolves extremely rich when it first came out. he continued. "What have you done for me aside from mooching off of me because you can't even get a job of your own? You're nothing compared to her. How dare you even question my decision to move on?" There was nothing else I could say. Nothing else that could come to mind aside from getting the hell away from him. I shoved Sam away finally, pushing myself away from the wall. "Fuck you," I growled, my rage taking over as I raised my hand and slapped him hard across the face. Passers-by were looking at us now, but I didn't care. Without another word, I turned on my heel and stormed away without looking back. As I walked numbly down the street and wiped the tears from my eyes, I thought about what Sam was like when we first met. He had been nothing more than a bullied omega in high school with no confidence, no prospects, and no friends. I had helped him gain confidence with my love and support, and this was how he repaid me? By leaving me for some blonde, all for a job at WearCorp? Nothing angered me more than knowing that my boyfriend of 3 years and best friend for 5 years had left me so easily over money and power. I was still fuming when I stepped out into the intersection, too numb to look properly before crossing. Just then, I heard the sound of a car honking and looked up to see a luxury car driving straight for me. Cursing to myself, I stumbled backwards and fell into a puddle just before the car hit me. The car came to a screeching halt next to me, which was surprising since I assumed that they would just drive away after nearly hitting me. But what surprised me even more was the person who sat inside the car when the window rolled down. Edric Morgan, CEO of WearCorp. Edric was known not only for being the youngest CEO in the history of the company and the heir to the largest fortune in the world, but also for his stunning appearance. And although I was incredibly hurt and angry about everything that had happened today, I couldn't help but notice his strong jawline, his muscular shoulders and arms, and his incredibly handsome face. I opened my mouth to say something about how he had nearly hit me, but before I could, he looked me up and down and tossed a wad of cash out the window, driving away with a rev of his engine. Edric Morgan, the CEO of WearCorp, had nearly hit me with his car and tossed me money like I was some beggar. All werewolves really were arrogant assholes. I threw the cash on the ground and stood, cursing under my breath as I realized how soaked and dirty my clothes were. I'd have to go home and see if I could scrounge up some change to take them to the laundromat so I could continue job hunting tomorrow, but admittedly, for now, I just wanted to drown my sorrows. I walked for a few blocks, finally spotting a bar that seemed nice and quiet. Taking a deep breath and smoothing down my stained shirt, I walked through the doors and approached the bouncer. The bouncer narrowed his eyes at me and looked me up and down, taking in my dirty appearance, sniffing the air in front of me. "No humans allowed without a member escort," he growled, folding his arms. I frowned. "Member?" I asked. "I'm a paying customer. Just let me buy a drink." The bouncer shook his head and began to usher me toward the door like I was some sort of nuisance. "Is this even legal?" I said, raising my voice. "You can't just discriminate against humans like this. Is my money worthless here just because of—" "She's with me," a stern and clear voice suddenly said from behind. The bouncer and I both looked up and turned to see a man in a suit standing on the stairs. "Edric Morgan, Moana. She's with me." The bouncer whipped around to face the man standing on the stairs. I stood there, my eyes wide, as I realized that the man who was mysteriously helping me get into the bar was the same man who had almost hit me with his car on the street and then promptly threw me a wad of cash like I was a beggar. Edric Morgan, CEO of WearCorp. I considered just turning around and leaving, but before I could, Edric came down the stairs and waved the bouncer away, fixing his steely gray eyes on me. "Come on," he said, peering around me to look out the door and onto the street. "It looks like it's going to rain again. You don't want to be walking around in the rain, do you?" I felt as though there was something a bit condescending in the wealthy werewolf's tone, but he was right. It had been raining for most of the day and had already begun to sprinkle again. I didn't want to walk home in the rain and get more soaked than I already was, so I silently followed Edric up the stairs. "You're still wearing those dirty clothes," Edric said in a somewhat cold tone of voice as we reached the top of the stairs. "I gave you money to replace them. Why didn't you use it?" I frowned. I may be a human, but I won't take money from rude and arrogant people who throw cash at me out the window of their car like I'm a beggar on the street. Edric sucked his teeth and looked me up and down for a moment before curtly turning to a woman who stood nearby. She seemed a little older than me and wore a plain black staff uniform. He muttered something to her that I couldn't quite make out, and she nodded, turning to me and smiling with one arm outstretched. "Right this way, miss," she said as Edric turned and disappeared into the main room of the bar. I glanced over my shoulder at him one last time as the woman guided me away, leading me upstairs to a private room. As she unlocked the door and opened it, my eyes widened. The room was full of racks of expensive clothing, shoes, and accessories. "What's this?" I asked, turning to face the woman. "We like to provide the best for our patrons," the woman replied with a smile. "This room is specially designed for our female patrons to come and freshen up, touch up their makeup, or perhaps change their clothes in the event of a wardrobe malfunction. It's not normal practice to allow a human to use our facilities, but seeing as Mr. Morgan owns the majority share of this club, you're welcome to wear whatever you like. Take your time." Before I could say anything else, the woman closed the door and left me alone. I looked around at all of the expensive clothes and fine jewelry with a puzzled expression on my face. Was Edric Morgan not so arrogant and cruel as I thought? Did he feel badly about our encounter in the street and wanted to make it up to me? Or was this all some sort of sick joke? Either way, I was still too distraught over discovering my boyfriend with his mistress earlier, and this seemed to be my ticket to having a good night. I eventually emerged from the room wearing a simple black dress that reached my ankles. It was made of a soft silk, with thin straps and a plunging neckline. I also picked out a pair of strappy black heels and a clutch purse. When I came down the stairs with the woman, I felt my heart start to race as I noticed Edric look up from his table. His eyes lingered on me for a few long moments that felt like an eternity before he looked back to continue his conversation with the other man who was sitting with him. To compensate for the accident earlier on the street, "Mr. Morgan has agreed to cover the expenses of the evening," the woman said. "That includes any drinks and food you order, as well as the clothes. Please feel free to take a seat at the bar." I looked down at my dress, feeling my face go a bit hot. Something like this was so far from what I normally wore, and now it was mine. I glanced up to ask the woman if she was sure I could keep the dress, but she was already gone. Swallowing, I walked into the main area and slid up onto one of the bar stools. "What would you like to drink?" the bartender said. Gin and tonic, please," I replied, fiddling with the clasp on my purse as I glanced around at all of the other bar patrons. Most of them seemed too preoccupied with their drinks and their conversations as a woman in a red gown softly played the piano on a small stage. The bartender returned with my drink a few moments later. I muttered some words of thanks and swirled the liquid around in my glass as I attempted to settle into my seat and try not to act too out of place. "What's a beautiful girl like you doing sitting all alone?" a male voice suddenly said from beside me. I jumped a bit and turned to see a middle-aged man in a suit leaning on the bar next to me with a drink in his hand. He had salt and pepper hair, a somewhat stocky build, and smelled strongly of whiskey. I couldn't come up with an answer, so I awkwardly laughed and took a sip of my drink in the hopes that the man would get the hint and leave me alone, but he persisted. Despite Edric Morgan's burst of kindness in letting me into this bar and paying for everything, I was still uninterested in doing much more than having a drink or two and going home for the night. After finding my boyfriend with another woman, I wasn't interested in conversation. "Let me buy you another drink," the man said, leaning closer to me. "Something better than gin and tonic. I've got plenty of money, being a beta and all. You can have anything you want." "Oh, I'm fine with this," I said with a weak smile, trying to hide my disgust over hearing the word beta. "Thanks anyway." "Nonsense," the man said, either not noticing or not caring that I wasn't interested as he sat on the stool next to me, his body uncomfortably close to mine. "I'm Mark, by the way, Mark Schaffer." He stuck out his hand for me to shake, and when I did, his palm was a bit sweaty. "Moana," I muttered, pulling my hand away as soon as possible. "Interesting name," he said. I'm the beta of. My mind went blank as Mark continued to prattle on about his money, his lineage, his multiple vacation homes, this and that. I tried my best to appear polite, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. So that's why I prefer the Goulet yacht. I've got to use the restroom, I said suddenly, interrupting his spiel about which type of yacht was the best. He frowned as I abruptly stood and gathered my purse, clearly annoyed that I cut him off. But I didn't care. Without another word, I walked to the bathroom and shut the door behind me, taking a few deep breaths as I leaned on the sink. I stayed in there for a few minutes, splashing some cold water on my face and checking my phone until I was certain that Mark had gotten bored of waiting for me at the bar, then headed back out. Thankfully, he was gone when I walked back to my seat. I let out a small sigh of relief as I sat back down, but that relief turned to annoyance when the bartender approached me and handed me a red drink in a cocktail glass, informing me that Mark had paid for it. Sighing, I picked up the glass and looked over my shoulder. Mark was sitting at a corner table, watching me like a hawk. Not wanting to cause any sort of fuss, I raised my glass and mouthed the words, "Thank you," before turning back and sipping on the drink. As my head started to get light and the room started to swim around me a few minutes later, I realized that taking a drink offered to me by a strange man at the bar was a horrible idea. But I was too far gone already, and as I tried to get up from the bar, I felt myself stumble into a man's body. "Whoa there," Mark's voice said as his arms wrapped around me. "Looks like I need to get you home." I felt my heart start to race as Mark began to guide me away, too weak and disoriented to tell him no. Just then, as my vision began to fade completely, I felt another hand on my shoulder, cool and not sweaty like Mark's. "Where are you taking her?" Edric's stern voice said so low it was almost a growl. "Oh, I'm just taking her home," Mark stuttered. "She had too much to drink. We're old friends." "Is this true?" Edric said, leaning down and coming into view. As his gray eyes locked on mine, all I could do was shake my head. I wasn't sure what happened after that, but the next thing I knew, I was in Edric Morgan's warm embrace in the back of a car. "Where do you live?" he asked. I tried to answer, but he stopped me after I mumbled a few unclear words. "I'm taking you to a hotel, then." In my semi-conscious state, the feeling of Edric's warm arms around me made my body tingle. "Stay," I slurred, nuzzling into the crook of his neck. Edric jolted away, muttering something about my state of mind, but something about the smell of his cologne made me persist. And soon I felt Edric Morgan, the wealthy and handsome CEO of WearCorp, relax into my touch. Moana. I woke up to sunlight and a fresh, warm summer breeze streaming in through a large set of open French doors. As I cracked my eyes open, the sound of the city street below filled my ears, and the feeling of my throbbing head on a plush pillow alerted me to the fact that I was not in my own bed. Groaning, I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows and scanned the room as flashes of what happened the night before began to flood my mind. I remembered being at the bar, in the silky black dress that I had picked out. I remembered drinking a gin and tonic and being accosted by a middle-aged man with sinister intentions. Other memories came flooding back, too. I remembered being in the back of a car with a handsome man. His neck was warm and soft as I pressed my lips to it. He tried to hide his arousal at first, but he eventually gave in to his desires as he led me to the elevator that led up to the expensive hotel room he had booked. We made our way to the room, stopping periodically to press our lips together and touch each other's bodies in the hallway. I remembered how electric his hands felt on my body as he gripped my waist through the silky black dress, and how quickly he removed that dress once we were safely inside the hotel room. He carried me over to the bed while I kissed his neck and nibbled at his ears, his body pressing into mine as he laid me down on the soft blankets. I clung onto his chest like my life depended on it, fumbling to unbutton his shirt. He eventually became tired of waiting for my clumsy fingers to undo the buttons and did it himself, revealing thick, toned muscles as he pulled his shirt off. We spent the night in ecstasy, moving as one in the moonlit hotel room. As I came to the realization of what happened last night, I slowly turned my head to face the man who laid asleep next to me. Even asleep, the man was still as handsome and sexy as ever, with the sheets pulled down around his waist to reveal his chiseled torso and the top of his groin, making my face get hot and turn red. But he was Edric Morgan. He was my cheating ex-boyfriend's new boss. I bit my lip and quietly climbed out of bed, searching for my panties. Ahem. I spun around with my panties in my hand to see Edric sitting up in bed, his cold gray eyes fixed on me. Without a word, he stood, making me blush as he completely revealed his nude body, and walked over to where his pants lay on the floor. I quickly pulled my panties and my bra on as he put on his boxer briefs, then watched as he picked up his pants and dug into his pocket for his wallet. "Here," he said darkly, digging into his wallet and pulling out a thick wad of cash. He walked over to me and thrust it toward me. "Take it, but keep in mind that this is a one-time deal." I took a few steps back, my sheepish expression turning to one of anger and resentment. "You think I'm a prostitute?" I snarled. Edric merely shrugged and tossed the cash at my feet. "It doesn't matter if you are or you aren't," he said coldly, walking away and pulling his pants on with his back turned to me. "No one sleeps with me without the expectation of getting something extra in return. Your aloof demeanor last night faded away pretty quickly as soon as I dressed you up and paid for your drinks, so I know what you're after. Just take the money and leave." I frowned, narrowing my eyes. "I never wanted your money," I said, my voice shaking out of anger as I picked the dress up off the ground and put it on. If I still had my own clothes, I would have left the dress on the floor, but I had no idea what happened to my stained outfit at this point. "By the way," Edric muttered, ignoring what I said and buttoning his shirt with his back still turned to me, "you should learn not to take drinks from strangers. You're lucky I was there to save you from that guy. Learn from basic common sense next time." I paused, gritting my teeth, and pulled the dress on the rest of the way before answering. "You're just as cold and heartless as they say." Edric didn't answer, and I didn't care to stick around to see if he would come up with one. With a humph, I grabbed the strappy heels from the night before and stomped barefoot over to the door. My hand rested on the doorknob for a moment as I fumed, and when I swung the door open, I called over my shoulder one last time. "You can't just throw money at everyone when you have a guilty conscience," I growled before walking out and slamming the door behind me. As soon as I got home, I tore off the dress and the heels and threw them in the corner as the anger over both Sam and Edric bubbled up inside of me. Frowning and muttering to myself, I stomped over to the fridge in my underwear and pulled out the milk to pour myself a bowl of cereal. Cereal was just about all I had to eat, but the thought of taking Edric Morgan's money after a one-night stand made me feel worse than going hungry. As I was just about to take my first bite of cereal, my phone started ringing. I rolled my eyes, anticipating for it to be Sam trying to beg for me to come back, but squinted when I noticed that it was an unknown number. "Hello?" I said, stirring my cereal with my spoon, half expecting a spam caller to be on the other end. "Good morning. Is this Moana Fowler?" "Yes," I replied. "My name is Nancy Grace. I'm calling from the au pair agency." My eyes widened and I dropped my spoon, not caring as it sank down all the way into the milk. I had been trying to find a nanny job through the au pair agency for months now, but they hadn't found any suitable work for me yet. It had been so long that I had completely lost hope at this point. "We found an assignment for you," Nancy said in a sing-song voice. "It's a full-time live-in position with a single alpha father. Are you available to make a house call later today to meet the family and complete an interview?" "Yes," I said, using all of my energy to keep my composure. "I'd be happy to." "Great," Nancy replied. "You're expected at 2 o'clock today. I'll text you the address once we end the call." "Thank you so much," I replied. "You're welcome. Oh, and Moana, you should know that you're not going to be the only candidate for this position. I would recommend taking extra care to make a good first impression. Working for this family is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and the pay is unparalleled." I felt my heart sink at Nancy's words and opened my mouth to ask who the family was. But before I could, Nancy hung up and I was met with silence on the other end. Furrowing my brow at the abrupt end to the call, I set down my phone and stared at it as the notification with the address details popped up on my screen. What sort of family would be paying a nanny so well like this? Moana. I pulled up to the address of the house a couple of hours later wearing a brand new set of clothes. During the time between getting the phone call and arriving, I took out my credit card, which I only used for emergencies, and ran out to buy something new to impress the family. It was just a crisp button-down shirt, tailored pants, and loafers. But as I pulled up to the enormous mansion in the mountains and saw the line of women at the door, I was glad that I had purchased the new clothes. I made sure to double-check that the tags on the clothes were hidden, which I had kept on in case I didn't get the job and would need to return them. As I parked and walked up the pathway to the front entrance and got in line with my resume in my hand, my heart started to pound. My heart started to pound even more when I noticed that women were not only filing into the mansion, but were also coming out with sad and defeated expressions on their faces. One girl, who was very pretty and looked a little younger than me, even had tears streaming down her cheeks as she came out with her resume crumpled up in her hands. Was the employer so awful that he was making these poor women cry during their interviews? As the line got shorter and I slowly made my way inside, I felt a lump rise in my throat. The inside of the house was stunningly beautiful, with dark Tudor-style wainscoting and creaky wooden floors. There was a massive double staircase in the front foyer, which was where the women would go when their names were called, up one side looking excited and confident, and down the other side looking defeated after their interviews. "Name?" a woman's voice said from in front of me. I looked up to see an older woman with gray hair that was pulled back into a tight, slick bun. She wore a dark blue dress with a high collar that was buttoned all the way up and had a clean gray apron on top that looked like it was freshly ironed. Needless to say, as she stared at me with her thin lips pressed into a straight line, she made me nervous. "Moana Fowler," I said, feeling my voice crack a bit under the pressure. The woman muttered something to herself and looked down at the clipboard in her hand, making a tick mark next to my name. "You're human?" she said, shooting me a somewhat disgusted look. I nodded. "Very well, take a seat." I walked over to the area where other women were sitting and found a spot in a plush armchair in the corner, where I sat quietly and mulled over my potential responses to interview questions in my head. My train of thought was broken a few minutes later, as an older woman came running down the stairs in hysterics. "She's a little monster," she said, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "In all my years of being a governess, I have never, and I mean never, met such a cruel little thing." The room fell silent as the woman marched out, followed by a few other women who must have decided that whatever waited for them upstairs wasn't worth it. I, along with several others, decided to take the risk. I really needed this job, regardless of the child's behavior. The children at the orphanage I volunteered at absolutely loved me, even the difficult ones, and I was certain that I could find the good side in this child too. I sat there for hours while I waited for my turn to have my interview, and eventually, as the sun went down and I sank into the plush armchair, I found myself involuntarily nodding off. My night out with Mr. Edric Morgan left me more exhausted than I was willing to admit. "Moana Fowler." I jumped, awoken abruptly as the stern woman from before called my name, and looked up to see her standing over me. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, sitting upright and nervously wiping a bit of drool off of the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand. "Is it my turn?" I looked around to see that the waiting room was completely empty. "Go home," the woman said sternly, stepping away from me and gesturing toward the door. "But I haven't had my interview," I said frantically, standing with my resume clutched in my hand. "I'm sorry I dozed off, but it's been hours." "Ella doesn't wish to see any more candidates," she interrupted. "Especially not young, pretty girls such as yourself." I felt my heart drop into my stomach as I shook my head vehemently. "No," I pleaded. "Please let me see her. I promise you won't regret it if you just give me a chance." The woman stared at me for several painfully long moments before sighing. "Fine," she said, turning and starting to ascend the stairs. "But don't say I didn't warn you." I excitedly followed the woman up the stairs, where she silently led me down a wide hallway that was lined with large, ornate wooden doors. Finally, we stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. She opened the door and let me in without a word. "I told you I'm tired," a small voice growled from behind a high-backed chair that faced the empty fireplace. "I don't want to see anyone else." "Well, I'd like to see you," I said softly, stepping toward the chair. A small head of blonde hair poked out from behind the chair and glared at me, appraising me, for several moments as I stood in the middle of the room. Suddenly, as if my appearance didn't meet her standards, the little girl leaped out of her seat and rushed toward me, her childish face twisted into an angry snarl and her werewolf fangs bared. Between the mop of messy blonde hair poked two pointed little ears on either side of her head, which twitched backward aggressively. I stood my ground and stared down at the little ball of fury, which only became more furious as I continued to ignore her displays of aggression. "Why aren't you running like the rest?" she shouted, her high-pitched voice turning into a squeal. I crouched down to meet the little girl's gaze. Her hair had fallen into her eyes. I slowly extended my hand to brush it away. She flinched, growling and baring her teeth, but let me do it when I persisted, revealing sparkling blue eyes. "You're very pretty," I said softly, watching intently as the little girl's ears pricked up and her lips slowly closed. "What's your name?" She paused, staring at the floor, and when she spoke, her face was still pointed down at it. "Ella." "Nice to meet you, Ella," I said. "My name is Moana. Can I ask why you want to scare me away?" "My daddy is a handsome and rich man," she said, her voice now a whisper. "All of the young and pretty girls like you just want to work for him so they can marry him and take his money. No one wants to be here for me. I told Miss Selena that I didn't want to see anyone else, but she brought you instead." I paused for a moment, feeling tears prick at the backs of my eyes at the little girl's words. "You know," I said softly, holding out my hand with my palm up and feeling the dread lift out of my stomach as Ella touched my fingers. "I was an orphan when I was your age. I understand what it's like to not feel wanted." "Really?" Ella said, looking up at me with wonder on her face. "You're not here to steal my daddy away?" I shook my head, holding back laughter as I thought about how silly it would be for a wealthy alpha werewolf to be interested in me, a human. "No," I said gently. "I'm here for you." Ella and I both looked up as we heard the door creak open. I looked over my shoulder, still crouching, to see the woman from before standing in the doorway. "It's past your bedtime, Ella," she said, clasping her hands in front of her. "I want this one," Ella said, walking cheerfully past me and skipping out the door as if she hadn't just been threatening to bite my face off. The old woman, Selena, as I had discovered her name was, cast me a disbelieving look, her eyes narrowing as she sized me up. "Humph," she said under her breath once Ella was out of earshot. "What did you do to make her choose you?" I shrugged. "Finding a common ground is a powerful thing," I said, following Selena from the room. When we got downstairs, Selena opened the front door to let me out. "We have your address on file, and a car will be waiting for you first thing in the morning to take you to sign your contract and begin your first day. Be ready at 6 o'clock sharp, and not a moment later." Smiling, I nodded and walked past Selena with a light feeling in my body despite her curt attitude, then paused and turned around to face her. "What was the father's name, by the way?" I asked. Selena pursed her lips and looked at me coldly. "You'll receive the details once you sign your contract," she said, promptly closing the door in my face and leaving me alone on the doorstep. Moana. I woke up at 4:30 the next morning. A bit earlier than I needed to, probably, but I wasn't taking any chances with this job. I spent the next hour practically scrubbing myself raw in the shower, fixing my hair, ironing my clothes, and taking extra care to make sure that there wasn't a single stray hair or speck of dust on me, because today was the first day of the job that would change my life, and I had to be perfect. I then spent the final half hour of my preparations pacing and staring out the window, willing myself with all of the strength I had to not bite my nails, as I waited for the car that Selena had mentioned. Lo and behold, as soon as the clock struck 5:59, I saw a black car slowly pulling up out front, and I practically flew out of my apartment and down the stairs so that I was opening the car door by 6 sharp. "Humph," Selena said, looking at her watch as I clambered into the back. 6 o'clock on the dot. A little out of breath, but at least you're here. Sorry, I said, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear and buckling my seatbelt. It's a bad neighborhood, so I didn't want to wait outside. Selena didn't answer. The driver pulled the car away from the curb and started heading down the street. We'll be stopping to sign your contract with the lawyer first, Selena said, her voice flat as she looked out the window with a modicum of disgust on her wrinkled face. Then, you'll get a tour of the penthouse apartment where you'll be spending most of your time. I suspect you won't be needing to return to your old home to collect your things. I thought back to my apartment and its contents. Well, I have some clothes and things there. Your employer will supply you with anything you need: clothes, toiletries, books, and anything else you might need or want. Unless you have sentimental belongings you need to go back for, I wouldn't recommend wasting your time and energy on such a move. I nodded, clutching the tiny silver locket around my neck. That locket was the only sentimental thing I owned, and it was always around my neck. Everything else in that apartment could burn, for all I cared. Very well, Selena said. We spent the next several minutes of the car trip in complete silence. Although Selena was seated directly across from me in the back of the expensive town car, she didn't turn away from the window to look at me even once. I didn't let it get to me, though. Growing up human in a world dominated by werewolves prepared me for this sort of treatment. There were many werewolves who saw humans as equals, but there were even more who saw us as an inferior race. Selena was likely one of them. The driver eventually pulled the car over in front of a brownstone with large bay windows, with a sign over the door that read William Brown, S. Keeg. Selena got out of the car without a word and started for the door. I did the same, standing behind her as she rapped on the door with the brass knocker. The door swung open a few moments later and a young woman let us in. The office smelled like a sickly combination of mahogany and burnt coffee, and it was eerily quiet. Neither Selena nor the woman said a word. The woman only shut the door behind us and gestured toward a half-open door at the end of a short hallway. And when we entered, there was an old man sitting behind an enormous wooden desk. He was asleep. Selena cleared her throat loudly and sat down in the chair across from him, and when he still didn't wake, she swiftly kicked him under the desk. "Wake up, William!" "What? Oh!" the old man exclaimed with a start as he was unceremoniously awoken. I stifled a laugh as I stood in the doorway, but my smile quickly faded when Selena abruptly turned around and gestured with her head for me to sit. "Right," William said, putting on his glasses with shaking old hands as he opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of documents. "Now, let's see." The cuckoo clock on the wall behind him ticked in time with my racing heartbeat and filled my ears, driving me practically insane, as the elderly lawyer licked his fingers and flipped through the documents. Finally, after a painstakingly long time and a curt ahem from Selena, he produced the packet of paperwork for me and set it down in front of me with a pen. "You'll just have to sign this basic contract and an NDA," he said. I leaned forward and picked up the pen, scanning over the contract. My eyebrows raised as I noticed a couple of interesting clauses thrown in. One mentioned that I was not allowed to become romantically involved with my employer at any point, and another stated that I was prohibited from becoming pregnant with my employer's child without permission. What are these clauses for?" I asked, pointing to them. William leaned over and glanced at them, then waved his hand dismissively. "All very standard." But I "Just sign the agreement," Selena growled under her breath. "Unless you think you will break the clauses." No, I said, quickly scrawling my signature down on the dotted line and sliding the contract back to William. "I would never. I was just curious." Selena let out another humph and stood, smoothing down her skirt. "Well, that's finished," she said, nodding politely to William, who seemed already exhausted from our brief interaction. "Let's go, Moana." We arrived at the location where I would be working and living a few minutes later. It was vastly different from the Tudor-style mountain mansion I had visited the day before, but equally as massive and beautiful. Selena and I walked through the marble lobby and took the elevator up a few dozen stories before coming out into a gorgeous entryway with cherry wood parquet floors and large, arched windows that were reminiscent of an expensive Parisian apartment. Ella was waiting for us when we arrived. She looked much more put together and far less feral than the night before, wearing a prim baby blue dress with ruffles and a bow in her hair. Much to mine and Selena's surprise, Ella threw her arms around me in a tight hug and then took my hand, leading me away from Selena and around the massive apartment on a tour, which took over an hour since the place was so large, and I was thoroughly exhausted by the time it was over. Ella's bedroom alone was bigger than my old apartment. Finally, after she introduced me to the twin maids, Lily and Amy, Ella led me to what would be my room. "This is your room," she said, pushing open a large set of double doors with her tiny hands. I stifled a gasp as I saw how spacious and beautiful it was, with even a small balcony that overlooked the city below. "This is mine?" I asked, unable to contain my disbelief. Ella said, climbing up on the bed and bouncing a bit. "Come feel the bed." Smiling, I walked over to the bed and sat down next to Ella. "Wow, it is bouncy," I said, to which Ella giggled and flopped onto her back, arms outstretched. I took the silence and the fact that we were alone as an opportunity to get to know Ella a bit better, as well as to pry a bit for information on this mystery father to make sure that he wasn't a complete weirdo. "So, can you tell me anything about your parents?" I asked. "Do you have a mom?" Ella shook her head, still laying back and staring up at the ceiling. "Nope, I never met my mom. She died when I was born." "Oh," I replied, my voice faltering. "I'm sorry." Ella merely sat up and shrugged, hopping off of the bed to walk over to the dresser and play with the ornate drawer knobs. "It's okay. I'm happy with just my daddy. He's always nice to me. I just wish he could spend more time with me." I stood and walked over to Ella. She turned and looked up at me, her eyes just as blue as they had been the night before. "I'm sure he wishes he could spend more time with you too," I said. That evening, after spending the entire day together playing games, Ella and I were sitting on the living room floor while Amy and Lily prepared dinner. I was watching as Ella drew a picture with crayons, helping her to draw things that she couldn't quite figure out yet for herself, when I heard the front door click open. Ella jerked her head up and suddenly dropped her crayons, jumping up and running out into the foyer. "Daddy!" she yelled. I took a deep breath and stood, smoothing down my shirt and quickly fixing my hair, as I prepared to meet my employer for the first time. "Hey, Princess, did you have a good day?" My eyes widened as I heard his voice. It seemed I already knew this wealthy, handsome father I had heard so much about, Moana. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my back turned to the door as I heard footsteps approaching. How did this happen? How did I wind up finally becoming employed, only for it to turn out that my new employer was the same person who I had a one-night stand with just 2 nights ago? The footsteps came closer. I felt like a deer in headlights. "Good evening, Miss Moana," that all-too-familiar voice said from behind me. "Can we speak privately for a minute?" I slowly turned around to face Edric Morgan, the handsome and wealthy werewolf CEO, the extremely well-known public figure, the man who I had slept with 2 nights ago, the man who tried to throw money at my feet like I was a prostitute. He stood in front of me, with Ella in his arms, the perfect picture of a loving father. "Yes," I stammered. I watched as he set Ella down, then gestured for me to follow him. As I did, it felt like I was swimming through mud, like my limbs were heavy and useless. Was I dreaming? We walked through the living room and into his study. I remembered it from my tour with Ella earlier. It had enormous bookshelves lining the walls that rose all the way to the ceiling, with a large carved stone fireplace and 2 tall, arched windows. There was a mahogany desk in the middle of the room and a small seating area by the fireplace. At the time that Ella showed me this room, I had found it stunningly beautiful. Now it felt like a coffin. "I'm so sorry," I said as soon as the door clicked shut behind us. I stayed by the door, watching as Edric casually walked over to one of the plush chairs by the fireplace and sat down. "I didn't know that you would be the employer. If I had known, I wouldn't have applied. I promise this isn't a ploy to get money from you." "It's all right, Moana," Edric said, rubbing his tired eyes. "I knew it was you when I hired you. I did it on purpose." I scrunched my eyebrows together. "What do you mean?" "Ella may be stubborn, but I'm not completely detached from the hiring process," Edric replied. I wanted to give you a chance. But you treated me like a beggar, like I was a... I lowered my voice so Ella couldn't hear. A prostitute. And now you give me a job opportunity? What's the catch here? You wouldn't take the money I gave you on the street, he replied coldly, standing. After that, you wouldn't take the money I tried to give you after our one-night stand, because apparently your pride is more important than paying your rent. I may seem like an arrogant asshole to you, but I do not owe anyone, and I know a desperate person when I see one, so I did the next best thing since you don't seem to like handouts, and I gave you a job. I took a few steps toward him, clenching my fists. I passed that interview fair and square, I said. Why are you making it out like I'm a charity case? Edric scoffed and folded his arms across his chest. Oh, please, your application was tossed into the reject pile the first day you sent it. I decided to give you a second chance when there were dozens of other people with better experience and a better education. A lump started to rise in my throat as Edric spoke. Was this all I was? A charity case? A pathetic example of someone who was just supposed to be grateful that the all-knowing and powerful Edric Morgan gave me a chance to work for him after sleeping with me in a hotel room? You know, I growled, taking another step closer. For a man who complained that his one-night stand was just after him for money, it's awfully convenient that you would suddenly want me to live with you. You signed the contract, he replied, fixing his steely gaze on me. You know the stipulations of the clauses, and I highly doubt you have the courage to break them. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Edric and I both looked up to see Ella standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her cheeks. You promised you wouldn't try to steal my daddy away, she snarled. Even from where I stood, I could see her little fangs poking out and her claws extended. You're a liar! Ella. Before I could stop her, the little girl turned on her heel and ran away, sobbing. I whipped back around to glare at Edric, whose gaze had shifted from cold to concerned in a matter of moments. You should be ashamed of yourself, I said, walking toward the door. You knew exactly what you were doing when you hired me. I stormed out of Edric's office and found Ella's room, but the door was locked when I tried to open it. Ella, please talk to me, I said through the door. There was a brief silence, followed by an angry, "Go away!" Sighing, I turned around to see Selena standing at the end of the hallway, her thin arms folded disappointedly across her chest. No doubt she had heard the entire interaction and was looking down on me, too. I couldn't stay in a place where everyone was suspicious of me, like I was some sort of grifter just trying to weasel money out of a wealthy CEO. I would rather be homeless. I stormed past Selena and went to my room, where my purse with my few belongings sat on the dresser. Hopefully my landlord hadn't locked me out of my apartment yet. Without a word, I stormed out of the apartment building and back out onto the dark street, collecting my bearings for a moment before finding the nearest subway and heading home. Just as I feared, my apartment was locked up tightly when I returned, with an eviction notice on the door. I hit the door with my fist and cursed out loud before heading back out onto the street. It looked like I was going to be putting another charge on my credit card, this time for a motel. And dinner, because I was starving. As I walked down the street, digging through my purse to see if I had enough cash to buy a couple slices of pizza, I suddenly stopped short and felt the hairs on the back of my neck raise as the overwhelming feeling of being watched came over me. I slowly turned my head to see two large men walking toward me on the dark sidewalk. "Evening, miss," one of them said, his voice gravelly as though he smoked a pack of cigarettes a day. His eyes were a glowing orange color, which was utterly terrifying in the dark, and I realized as he came closer that there was a long scar running diagonally across his entire face. The other man was equally as frightening, with a long leather jacket and an almost hungry look on his face. I don't have any money," I said, starting to walk away briskly. My heart started to pound as they continued to follow me, and I began to swivel my head this way and that, looking for anyone who might be able to help. "We're not here for money," the man in the leather jacket said. "We're here for you." At that moment, every fiber of my being screamed for me to run. "Moana!" "Hey, stop!" the scar-faced man shouted. I ran as fast as I could, willing my legs to pump harder, to push me further away from the imminent danger that I sensed. I could hear the sound of footsteps pounding on the sidewalk behind me. I was just a human, and these men were werewolves. I should have known I wouldn't stand a chance trying to outrun them. I screamed for help, but no one came. No one ever came when a woman screamed for help in the city, and I cursed them for that in that moment. The sound of the men running behind me came closer. I felt as though my body didn't belong to me, like I was watching from a third-person perspective as I ran for my life. The two men gained on me. They were so close now that I knew that one misstep on my part would allow them to catch me. I felt a hand brush my shoulder and I shrieked, pushing myself faster as I glanced over my shoulder to look. Whack! I ran into something hard and gritty, a corner of a brick building. As I stumbled backwards, my head reeling from the impact, all I could feel were hands grabbing me. My vision faded, and the last thing I saw was the scar-faced man. I came to in the back of a car. My head was throbbing, and I felt as though I would vomit, which kept me from being able to scream or fight. Where were these strange men taking me? "She's awake," the gravelly voice that belonged to the scar-faced man said. I groaned. I tried to speak, to tell them to let me go, but all that came out was garbled nonsense. They stopped the car and got out, opening the back door and lifting my limp body out of the seat. As they half-carried me toward whatever fate that lay before me, my head lolled back on one of their shoulders. Above me towered the massive apartment building where I had just been earlier that day. Edric Morgan's penthouse. I felt myself go even weaker. The man in the leather jacket said something incoherent and picked me up fully, carrying me in through the brightly lit lobby. I heard the sound of the scar-faced man saying something to the concierge, followed by the ding of the elevator. I blacked out again. When I woke up again, I was laying on something soft. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a standing lamp. I groaned and attempted to sit up. Somehow, I managed to do it, although the dizziness got worse when I did. "You hit your head pretty good there, huh?" A familiar male voice said. I winced as I felt a damp cloth touch my tender forehead, another hand supporting my back from underneath as I struggled to stay upright. "Where am I?" "You're back in the penthouse." I blinked several times. Finally, Edric Morgan's devilishly handsome face came into focus. He was crouching in front of me with a concerned expression as he dabbed at my forehead with a damp cloth. I thought, as I slowly came back to consciousness, that I secretly caught him showing a bit of concern for me. Under any other circumstances, I would have felt like we had chemistry between us. "Why did you bring me back here?" I whispered, too weak to speak any more loudly. "Why did you run?" he asked instead of answering me, his face turning cold again as soon as he saw me looking. I didn't answer. Sighing, Edric set down the washcloth and propped a couple of soft pillows under me to help me stay upright, then stood and walked over to the window to look out onto the city street. "You already signed the contract," he said. "It's rude of you to run off like that. I'm only trying to help." "Trying to help by sending two terrifying men to attack me on the street in the middle of the night?" Edric turned back to face me. His expression was, unsurprisingly, cold and emotionless. "What did you expect me to do? They were never going to hurt you. From what I heard, you took off screaming before they could even talk to you." I groaned again and shut my eyes, tenderly touching my fingers to my forehead as a wave of dizziness took over me. Through my closed eyelids, I saw Edric's tall form approaching me once more and crouching down in front of me. He picked up the washcloth again and held it to my forehead. As he did, I heard the door click open. "Thank you, Selena," he said. I cracked my eyes open to see the housekeeper hand him a bottle of pills. He opened it and dumped two out into his palm, then held them out to me along with a glass of water. "It's just Advil," he said, noticing my hesitation to take the pills. "For the pain. Don't worry, I wouldn't drug you." I frowned, but gingerly took the pills and popped them into my mouth, washing them down with the glass of water. I heard Selena's footsteps receding, followed by the sound of the door clicking shut again. "You know, we did try to call you," he said, sitting on the arm of a chair across from me and folding his arms across his chest. "Several times, actually. As it turns out, you left your phone here by accident." He pulled my phone out of his pocket and tossed it onto my lap. The screen lit up as he did so, showing 5 missed calls. "Thanks," I said, slipping my phone into my own pocket. "But you should know that I don't have any intention of continuing to work for you." "I figured you would say that," he replied. "I suppose I could just as easily find someone else to fill your position, and would honestly prefer it myself at this point, but it seems Ella is quite taken with you." I furrowed my brow. Ella seemed too upset by our brief history to want anything to do with me. Edric merely shrugged, then called over his shoulder toward the door. "Come in. Ella, tell Moana what you told me." I sat up fully and looked over my shoulder to see Ella sheepishly walk into the room. She was looking at the floor and fiddling with a bow on her dress, looking embarrassed. "Go on, Ella," Edric said softly. "It's okay." "I'm sorry I yelled at you," she whispered. She looked up at me then, and her eyes widened when she saw me. "What happened?" I reached up and touched my forehead, then shook my head and held my hand out for her to take. "I'm okay, just bumped my head, that's all." Ella tentatively shuffled up to me, placing her small hand in mine as she studied my face. "I thought you lied to me," she said. "But then I remembered that you asked me about my parents, and Daddy told me that you didn't know who he was when you came to see me yesterday, so I forgive you. Do you want Moana to stay?" Edric asked. Ella nodded vigorously. "Yes, we had so much fun today. I want to have fun with you every day." The little girl's words made me smile and forget about everything else. How could I say no to her? "All right," I said to Ella, glancing briefly at Edric as he looked on with an icy stare. "I'll stay, but only if you promise to talk to me next time you get mad at me. Okay?" Ella nodded in agreement. "I promise." Then she pulled me closer and cupped her hands around my ear. "If my daddy is going to be with someone, then I suppose I'm okay with it being you." She pulled away with a smile on her face, then patted me on the shoulder and skipped out of the room before I could respond. What she had said was so adult-like. Children could be so strange sometimes. "So that settles it?" Edric asked once she was gone. "Will you stay?" His voice was flat, but I could sense a hint of pleading behind it. Somehow, I knew that Ella wasn't the only one who wanted me to stay. "Yes," I said. "I'll stay." Moana. After the entire debacle on my first night of employment, my first week went by smoothly and without a single hitch. Ella was a sweet little girl to take care of, and she caused very little trouble, if any at all. In fact, by the end of my first week, I started to feel a little guilty for accepting such a high salary for such an easy job and started helping Selena and the maids around the penthouse when I wasn't busy with Ella. Helping out with cleaning, cooking, laundry, and grocery shopping not only made me feel better about accepting the salary, but also made me feel less bored when I had nothing else to do. It didn't make Selena and the maids any more friendly toward me, but it certainly seemed to soften their demeanors a tiny bit as the days marched on. I also kept a distant but polite relationship with Edric. He wasn't around very often, usually only coming home late at night, so it was easy to keep a distance. I started to notice a strange occurrence, though. There was a drawer in the kitchen that Selena would periodically open using a small key. I didn't pay it much mind, just assuming that it was something private, but I was helping out with peeling potatoes in the kitchen one afternoon, while Ella was busy with her violin lesson, when I noticed Selena come in with a paper pharmacy bag. I watched quietly as she discreetly opened the bag, unlocked the drawer, and dumped the contents of the bag into the drawer. "Selena, can you help me?" Amy suddenly called from the other room. She sounded like she was struggling to carry something heavy. "Coming," Selena replied. She left the empty paper bag on the counter and scurried away, inadvertently leaving the drawer open. I tried to focus on peeling the potatoes, but I was nothing if not a curious person, probably a trait I picked up during my upbringing at the orphanage, and couldn't help myself from quietly sneaking over to the mysterious drawer. My brows knit together when I opened it to reveal bottles upon bottles of pills. Ambien, I whispered to myself as I picked up one of the bottles and read the label. Why were there so many sleeping pills in this drawer? Ahem. I jumped when I heard Selena clear her throat from behind me, accidentally dropping the bottle of pills in my hand and watching in horror as it rolled across the floor, eventually coming to a stop in front of Selena's feet. "I'm so sorry," I muttered. Selina sighed and stooped to pick up the bottle. She brushed past me and tossed it back into the drawer, closing and locking it again. I didn't mean to snoop, I said in a rushed voice. I just saw you left the drawer unlocked, and... It's all right, Selina replied as she dropped the small key into her apron pocket. I suppose it was only a matter of time before you got curious. I turned and watched as Selina walked over to the oven. She slipped a quilted oven mitt onto her hand and pulled out a steaming loaf of bread, then used the mitt to wave away some of the steam. May I ask who it's for? I asked. The pills, I mean. Mr. Morgan has been having trouble sleeping for years now, she replied, her back still turned to me as she turned the loaf pan upside down and let the fresh loaf of bread inside plop down onto the cutting board. His doses lately have been getting stronger. I'm not sure if the pills even help him at all at this point. It's not good for his body, the maid, Lily, said as she shuffled into the kitchen with a basket of clean linens. Those pills are too strong, and they're addictive. I blame it on that woman. Lily? Selina growled, whipping around to glare at Lily. Sorry, Lily muttered before continuing her work. I frowned, figuring I wasn't going to find out who that woman was, and returned to peeling the potatoes as I thought about Edric. Every time I had talked to him since I met him, he never seemed overly tired, and, now that I thought of it, he had woken up at almost the exact same time as I did when we spent the night together in the hotel. I had the chance to witness Edric's sleep deprivation firsthand that very night. I had just put Ella to bed. She insisted that I read her not one, not two, but 3 bedtime stories before she finally fell asleep halfway through the 3rd story, so I was up much later than usual. Normally I would be tucked away in my bedroom by the time with my headphones on, listening to quiet music while I drew in my sketchbook on my balcony, which meant that I rarely bumped into Edric at this time of night. As I was walking back to my room, however, I heard the sound of glass breaking in the living room, followed by a muffled "shit." I hurried toward the sound of the noise, worried that Edric had hurt himself. When I emerged into the living room, I saw him standing in the middle of the room, frowning down at the floor. He had his laptop balancing in one hand and was staring down at the floor in front of him, where a wine glass had shattered on the wood and red wine pooled up around his bare feet. When he heard me enter, he jerked his head up to look at me. His face looked sickly and pale. There was something else behind his eyes, too. He was drunk. "Do you need help?" I asked. Edric shook his head. "It's all right. The maid will clean it up in the morning." I frowned and brushed past him to retrieve a towel and the broom from the kitchen. "Nonsense," I said, ushering him out of the way when I returned. I bent down in front of him to wipe the wine up off of the floor, then swept the broken glass into the dustpan and dumped it in the trash. "See? It took 5 seconds." Edric swayed slightly in his spot for a moment before turning on his heel toward the kitchen. "I need another glass," he mumbled. My frown deepened. I grabbed him by the shoulder, taking him by surprise, and guided him over to the sofa. "Sit here," I said sternly, as though he was a child. "I'll get it for you." He didn't protest as I went into the kitchen to get him another glass, but as I got out the wine glass and lifted the half-empty bottle to pour, I decided against it and instead filled a glass with fresh, cold water. When I returned and handed the glass to Edric, he frowned. "This isn't wine." "No, it's not," I replied. "You're drunk enough as it is. Would you want your daughter to come out here and see you like this? Besides, alcohol won't help you sleep. If anything, it'll keep you up and leave you with a headache in the morning." Edric was silent for several moments as he stared at the glass of water in his hand. "You know about my sleeping troubles?" he asked, looking up at me with raised eyebrows. I nodded. "I saw the pills," I responded, pausing. "Is it like this every night?" Edric nodded hesitantly. "Every night. Except there was one time recently." His voice faltered, and before I could tell him to continue, his face shifted back to its usual cold expression. He set the glass of water down on the coffee table and began typing on his laptop. "Thank you for the water," he said. "You can go now." As I slept that night, I had a strange dream. I was standing on a cliff, looking out over the sea. There was a disembodied voice speaking to me. "I am your wolf. My name is Mina," the voice said slowly and softly, like the wind. But when I looked for the source of the voice, there was no one there. I awoke with a start in the morning, feeling uncomfortable after my strange dream. Had I already spent so much time living with werewolves that their customs were starting to work their way into my dreams? Shuddering, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. As my sleepy vision began to focus, I nearly screamed. Someone was in my bed, and it was Edric, Moana. As soon as I saw Edric sleeping on the other side of my bed, I immediately averted my gaze down at myself to make sure that I was still dressed. I was still fully clothed, and this time I knew for a fact that I hadn't hooked up with him. I was completely sober when I went to bed, so I would have remembered. So why was Edric in my bed? While I was still processing what was going on, Edric's eyes suddenly opened and he stared right at me. I yelped and jumped out of the bed, running to the other side of the room. "What are you doing in here?" I asked, my voice shaking. Edric slowly sat up and looked around, looking equally as confused as I was. "I have no idea," he said, looking down at himself in the same manner I did, no doubt to also check to make sure he was fully clothed. "I was really drunk last night. I guess I confused your room with mine." "Your room is all the way on the other side of the penthouse," I growled, "and it's an entirely different layout. You weren't so drunk that you would have made such an obvious mistake in your own home." Edric was silent for several moments before throwing the covers off of himself and swinging his long legs over the edge of the bed. "I'm sorry," he said, standing and splaying out his hands with his palms facing outward in a display of surrender. "I really don't know what happened. Last I remember." His voice faded and his brow furrowed. "What do you remember?" I asked incredulously. I was appalled that he would have me sign a contract stating I wouldn't get romantically involved with him, only for him to violate those terms within the first week by crawling into my bed in the middle of the night. He shook his head, frowning as he stared down at the floor. "I was awake for quite a while after you went to bed. I couldn't sleep. But suddenly I started thinking about you and the night we spent together in the hotel." My frown deepened. "So, after all of the fuss you made with the contract and making me promise not to get romantically involved, you got sentimental over our one-night stand and climbed into my bed while I was sleeping?" Edric shook his head again, this time more vehemently. "No," he said, his face turning slightly red. "It wasn't like that. There's just something about you that helps me sleep. I remember when we slept together in the hotel, I slept like a baby that night for the first time in years. I don't know what it is, but it must have drawn me to you last night. But I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Unless—" I cocked my head to the side, partially frustrated by Edric's back-and-forth attitude, and partially intrigued by it. If he wanted to become involved with me so badly, why didn't he just say so without beating around the bush? Unless what? Unless I'll pay you to sleep with me, with clothes on, of course, nothing sexual. I scoffed, folding my arms across my chest. "Wouldn't that go against the contract that was so important to you?" I asked. "What, are you trying to make me break it so you can weasel a fine out of me or something?" "Moana, I'm a billionaire," Edric said with a laugh. "I don't have any desire to weasel any sort of money out of you. But I do need to sleep, and you seem to be the cure for my insomnia. We can write up a supplemental agreement. In exchange for a salary increase, we'll share a bed, just until I can get back into a normal sleep schedule. And then maybe I won't need to do it anymore. It won't hurt your contract at all." I narrowed my eyes and thought back to the image in my mind of the drawer full of pills in the kitchen, followed by the image of Edric drunkenly swaying in the living room while his daughter slept just a couple of rooms over. "If you really promise not to make it sexual." "I promise," Edric said. "I'm only thinking about what's best for my daughter, who, by the way, can never know about this." I paused for a moment, still feeling hesitant about agreeing to something like this, but a salary increase for simply sleeping next to someone was tempting. I could just see it as a way to pay off my student loans more quickly, and maybe he was right about it only needing to be temporary. "All right," I said with a pensive nod. "I'll do it." I spent the remainder of the day feeling distracted by my new agreement with Edric. Ella didn't seem to notice that my mind was wandering a bit as I helped her get ready for the day and attend her lessons, and if she did, She didn't say anything. Was this a bad idea? The last time Edric and I slept together, it had turned into a one-night stand and a subsequent argument. I couldn't deny the feelings that arose in me when I woke up to find him unexpectedly next to me. Even though we were fully clothed, would we be able to go through with this new arrangement without things getting too hot? Later that night, once Ella was sound asleep in her bed and Selena and the maids were asleep as well, I quietly made my way across the penthouse to Edric's room. I made sure to put on an extra layer over my pajamas as an added barrier, just in case. I quietly knocked twice on the door before opening it and slipping inside. I had only been in this room once very briefly when Ella gave me her tour. While Ella's and my rooms were both light and airy, Edric's room was more dimly lit. He seemed to like keeping the curtains shut, and there weren't any decorations inside. The furniture had a minimal feel to it, and everything was a dark color. It made the large room feel empty and desolate, especially with its high ceilings. As I walked over to Edric with the signed copy of the supplemental agreement in my hand and gave it to him, I pulled my cardigan closer around my body and shivered. I wasn't sure how I was going to sleep well in here. "Are you cold?" "I have extra blankets," Edric said when he saw me shiver, eyeing my extra layer of clothing. I shook my head and walked around to the other side of the bed. "I'm fine." I pulled back the black blanket and hesitantly climbed into the bed, making sure to stay all the way over on the edge. "You know I'm not going to touch you," Edric said with a scoff. "You don't have to be so far away, and there's no need for the extra layers of clothing." "I'd like to take my precautions," I replied coldly, and stuffed an extra pillow between us as a barrier before turning away and going to sleep. When I awoke the next morning, it was almost as dark as it was when we went to sleep, save for a few slivers of sunlight peeking through the dark curtains. Instead of feeling cold as I expected, however, I felt surprisingly warm and comfortable. Still half asleep, I nuzzled into the strong arms that were wrapped around me, hardly noticing that the pillow between us had fallen to the floor. Moana. Smiling to myself with closed eyes, I nuzzled deeper into the warm embrace of my bedmate, inhaling the smell of his chest. Wait. My eyes shot open, as did his at the same time. We stared at one another in disbelief for several long seconds before I felt my face get hot. There was no denying the chemistry in the air between us as we gazed at each other beneath the warmth of the sheets, but I knew deep down that this was wrong. Edric was my boss, and I had signed a contract to not get romantically involved. Blushing, I quickly pulled away and climbed out of the bed. I noticed that the cardigan I had worn to bed the night before now lay on the floor, so I picked it up and quickly put it on to cover myself while Edric sat up slowly in bed. "I'm sorry," I said, my back turned to him as I buttoned my cardigan. "Maybe this isn't the best idea." "Perhaps," he replied. His voice was low and gravelly from sleep, and it admittedly made me feel even more attracted to him. But I have to say that I haven't slept that well in ages, excluding our night in the hotel, of course. As I finished buttoning up my cardigan, I felt my face flush an even deeper shade of red. No response came to mind, so without a word, I quietly slipped out of Edric's room and hoped that no one would see me. Unfortunately, that wish did not come true, as I almost immediately bumped into Ella, who was standing outside of her father's room. "Oh, good morning, Ella," I said, trying to act nonchalant as I smiled at the little girl. She stared at me for a few moments, processing before she spoke. "What were you doing in my daddy's room?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. How could I possibly explain to a child that her father was paying me to sleep with him? While the simple agreement was that I was only there to sleep beside him to help him sleep and not become romantically involved, there was no way to explain that to the wary little girl without making it sound like I was a prostitute. Your daddy just called me in here to tell me that." My voice faltered as I tried to come up with an excuse. "That he wants me to take you out for breakfast before your training today." Ella's face lit up, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Really?" she said, her excited voice turning into a squeak. I nodded. "Really, go get ready. We can have crepes for breakfast at the bakery next door. I know they're your favorite." Ella squealed with delight and ran off. I pulled my cardigan tighter around myself, letting out a sigh of relief once she was out of sight. At least I had a way with children. I quickly went to my room and got dressed in something suitable for the summer heat, a comfortable cotton dress and a pair of sandals. I pulled my hair up into a ponytail, and by that point, Ella was already excitedly banging on my door and singing a made-up song about creeps. As we made our way downstairs and headed to the bakery, my strange new arrangement with Edric Morgan felt distant in my mind. As we were eating our breakfast together, however, something new came to my mind, a voice. It was clear as day and sounded nothing like my own inner thoughts. It was a woman's voice, but it was fading in and out. "Hello, Moana," it said, sounding distant and weak. I jumped a bit in shock, nearly dropping the forkful of crepes as I lifted it to my mouth. "Shh, I'm Mina. You're Wolf. You can just talk to me through our mind link." I tried to calm down. I had a wolf, but I was human. Well, if you are really my wolf, where were you then? "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to appear. I'm still weak, but I've been awakened by someone close to you. I'm not sure who, but I sense a strong connection." Ella cocked her head, speaking with her mouth full. "Are you okay?" she said, breaking my train of thought. I forced a weak smile and nodded, not wanting to reveal what was really going on inside my mind just yet. "Yes, I'm fine," I replied, reaching out to wipe a bit of whipped cream off of Ella's mouth with my napkin. "Don't talk with your mouth full." I can no longer connect to Mina after that, but what happened was real. I just realized that I never really knew who my real parents were. This Mina said that someone near me had a close connection. I thought of Ella, of the housekeeper, the maids. Could it be possible that I was related to any one of them? It was Saturday morning, which meant that Ella had her weekly werewolf training today. As Selena informed me, Ella had to go to these training sessions every week along with other werewolf children to learn how to use their abilities, control their wolves, and to get the chance to shift freely in a safe space. I had attended the first training with Selena and Ella, but this week I took Ella alone and was allowed to leave her there for a few hours, which gave me some time to do whatever I wanted. I hadn't been to the orphanage in some time, so once we dropped Ella off at her training, I agreed to meet the driver when her training was finished, as he had other work to do in the meantime, and decided to take a taxi to the orphanage. Not only was I missing the children there, but I also wanted to speak to someone about my records. Maybe they would have some answers about my lineage and could tell me whether I was human or not. When I arrived, the children seemed preoccupied with arts and crafts, but a few of them perked up when they saw me. "It's Moana," one little girl said, waving her tiny hand enthusiastically as I stood in the doorway of the recreation room. I waved back and smiled. "What are you all up to?" I asked. "Miss Ethan is teaching us how to make papier-mâché," a little boy, whose face was covered in glitter and the white water flower mixture used for the project, replied. "Ethan?" I said, cocking my head and furrowing my brow. "Ethan Bradley," a male voice said from behind me. I spun around to see a young man about my age. He was tall and had long brown hair that was pulled into a bun at the nape of his neck and wore a white apron over his clothes that was covered in paint. I immediately recognized him as a well-known artist from the city. My eyes widened. "Wow," I said, holding out my hand to shake his. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a huge fan of your work." Ethan smiled and shook my hand. "The kids here tell me that you're quite the artist yourself." I blushed, thinking about my sketchbook at home. "I sketch now and again, but I wouldn't consider myself much of an artist," I replied. "But I do find the combination of art and child psychology to be very interesting." Ethan paused, patiently mulling over my words before replying. "Why don't you come to my exhibit next week?" he replied, pulling a small card out of his apron and handing it to me. "And bring your sketchbook. I'd love to hear more." I took the card, a grin spreading across my face. "I'd be happy to come," I said. Ethan smiled and returned to his work with the children, leaving me in the doorway. "Moana," a familiar voice said from the stairway. I looked up and smiled to see the director of the orphanage, Sophia, coming down the steps. "What brings you here? I heard you got a new job. Live-in au pair, right?" I met her halfway, adjusting my purse on my shoulder with a nod. "Yes, I had a little free time, so I thought I would stop by. And I bit my lip, looking at the floor for a moment. I discovered something recently. It's about my identity. I was hoping you could tell me about how I came to be here when I was a child. Sophia's smile faded, replaced by an expression that I couldn't quite read. She nodded slowly, turning to go back upstairs. "Follow me," she said. "Moana." "Follow me," the director of the orphanage, Sophia, said. Her sad expression when I mentioned my identity gave me cause for concern, and as I followed her blonde head of hair up the narrow wooden stairs to her office, I felt my heart start to beat faster than it had been before. Sophia led me into her office and gestured for me to sit as she closed the door behind us. I sat on the edge of the straight-backed wooden chair across from her desk, clutching my purse nervously in my lap. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about your heritage sooner," Sophia said as she walked over to one of the tall metal filing cabinets at the back of the room that contained records of current and past children at the orphanage. "It's our policy to not bring it up for the sake of the children's mental health. I hope you understand." "Of course," I replied. I watched as Sophia pulled open one of the drawers and began thumbing through the rows of manila folders. Sophia had been here since I was a child. At the time, she was a spry young woman around the same age as I was now. Now, as I watched her search for my file, I noticed the slight hunch developing in her aging back, the tufts of gray hair that hadn't been dyed yet at the nape of her neck, and the subtle wrinkles starting to form on her hands and forearms. "Let's see," she whispered to herself, rifling through the folders until she found one with my name on it. "Here we go." She pulled it out and walked over to the desk, setting it down in front of me. I glanced up at her nervously for a moment, waiting for her nod of approval before opening the folder. Inside of the folder, aside from my basic intake files and other basic information, there was only one thing: a single, sharp canine tooth. I furrowed my brow and picked up the yellowed tooth, turning it over in my hand. There was a distinct crack down the center, but no other identifying features. "What is this?" I asked, looking back up at Sophia. Sophia sighed and sat down in her chair. "As you know, we get a healthy mix of both human and werewolf children," she said, leaning back and clasping her hands together across her stomach. "But what we don't often disclose is that werewolf parents will abandon werewolf children who were born without their wolves." My eyes widened and my fingers involuntarily closed around the tooth. "Why?" I asked, feeling the resentment toward werewolves bubble up inside of me. "Why abandon your child?" "Often, it's because they're ashamed of producing wolfless children," Sophia replied with a sad expression on her face. "But not always. You see, children without wolves would also often be subject to an entire host of discrimination for their entire lives. Some parents believe that it's better for them to grow up as humans, oblivious to their heritage." Sophia's words didn't make me feel any less resentful. If anything, they made it worse. "So, my parents left me because I was born without a wolf?" "I'm not sure, but that is my best guess," Sophia said. There was a long pause as I processed everything. "That doesn't mean necessarily that they didn't love you," she said. "The way that they left you, bundled up tightly with this tooth proving your heritage in your possession, has always made me think that they did it thinking that it was for your own good. Perhaps they had no choice, even." Sophia paused to take a breath, her lips spreading into a gentle smile as she began to reminisce. "I can still picture your chubby little fingers wrapped around that tooth. You wouldn't let go of it, you know. We had to take it while you slept." I opened my hand and looked down at the tooth again. I had been gripping it so hard that it left an imprint in my palm. "Do you think they left me with this tooth so I could find them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sophia was quiet for a few moments before she reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "That's up to you to decide," she said softly. As I walked back down the stairs, I felt Mina's presence again and asked her in my mind, "Why didn't you ever show yourself before?" Mina didn't answer, but I knew that she was just as confused by her late appearance as I was. I passed the recreation room once more on my way out and decided to stop by to say goodbye and to thank Ethan for his invitation. As I poked my head into the recreation room and saw Ethan sitting on the floor and helping the children with their papier-mâché, I couldn't help but smile. Even though what I had learned from Sophia made my resentment toward werewolves rise up inside of me, seeing an alpha werewolf being so kind as to teach orphan children restored my faith once more. Maybe werewolves really weren't all so bad, and maybe I wasn't quite as ashamed to be one myself. Ethan saw me looking and shot me a bright smile before jumping up and jogging over to me. "I meant what I said about the exhibition, by the way," he said. "I'd love to see your work. The children talk so fondly of you." I smiled down at the floor as I felt my face go a bit red at the alpha's kind words. "Thank you," I said, then bit my lip for a moment before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Ethan replied, sticking his hands into the pocket of his apron and cocking his head as he leaned against the doorframe. "Have you ever heard of werewolf parents abandoning wolfless children? And if so, have you ever heard of those children finding their parents again?" Ethan was silent for a moment, then nodded with a pained look on his face. "I've heard of that," he replied in a hushed tone so that the children couldn't hear. "But I've never heard of the children trying to find their parents. I don't think most of them would even want to find them once they find out, and besides, most werewolf parents would claim that the child died. I felt my heart sink. Had my parents claimed that I died? Would they even want me if I tried to find them again?" "Oh," I said, turning to leave. "Well, I was just wondering. Hope to see you again." I walked out of the orphanage and flagged down a taxi. As I settled into the back seat and watched the orphanage get smaller in the rear view mirror, I felt a prick in my palm and looked down to see that I was still tightly clutching the tooth in my hand. I was clutching it so tightly that it broke my skin, and I watched numbly as a thin stream of blood trickled down my palm. When I returned to the training facility to pick up Ella, our driver was already waiting for us. I waved at him as I jogged up to the door to pick up Ella, but as I entered, I didn't see her amongst the other children who were still waiting to be picked up. "Can I help you?" the attendant, a middle-aged man, asked when he noticed the confusion on my face. "Yes," I said, walking over to him. "I'm here to pick up Ella Morgan." The attendant scrunched his eyebrows together and looked down at his clipboard, shaking his head. "She already left quite a while ago." "Moana." I felt my heart sink into the pit of my stomach at the attendant's words. "She left quite a while ago. Did you not pick her up?" "Hold on," I replied, walking away briskly and trying to stay calm as I dialed the penthouse phone number into my cell phone and asked the concierge to direct me to Edric's suite. This had to be some misunderstanding. Surely Ella was safely home. Maybe Amy or Lily got confused with the schedule and picked her up without letting me know. "Hello," Selena's voice said on the other line after a few rings. "Selena," I said, trying to sound as calm and collected as possible, "did Amy or Lily pick up Ella from her training?" Selena was silent for a few moments before responding. "No, that's your job." Her voice sounded stern and cold, but I could sense a hint of fear behind it as she seemed to put two and two together. I knew that Selena cared for Ella just as much as I did, and the last thing she would ever want would be for something bad to happen to Ella. "Fuck," I whispered. "Excuse me?" Selena growled, irritated by my choice of language. "I'm sorry," I responded. "I got stuck in traffic when I was coming back to pick Ella up, and she's gone." I could hear Selena gasp audibly on the other end of the line. "You weren't there for her when she was finished with her training?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "I'm sorry, I just thought—" "No excuses," Selena said, her voice quivering with anger. "Find her." Before I could say anything else, Selena abruptly hung up the phone. The room spun around me as I stared down at my phone screen, but I knew I had to act quickly, for Ella's sake. Collecting myself as best I could, I ran out of the training facility and sprinted up to the car where the driver was waiting, climbing into the passenger seat. "Took you long enough. Are you all right? Where's Ella?" he asked, looking at me confusedly. "She took off while I was gone," I said hastily as tears streamed down my cheeks, trying to rack my brain as to where Ella might have run off to. Before I had left, I had mentioned to her that I was going to be at the orphanage. "Take me to the orphanage in the Waterside district," I said to the driver. "I have a feeling she went there to look for me." Nodding solemnly and with an angry look on his face, the driver stepped on the gas and peeled away from the curb. I quickly buckled my seatbelt and held on to the door handle for dear life as he sped down the road, passing other vehicles at dangerous speeds. As we flew down the city streets, all I could think of was Ella. Would I get to her in time? All of a sudden, as we were speeding through the city streets, I saw a familiar little head of blonde hair walking at an intersection a little ways away, all by herself. And at the same time, I saw a black sports car with tinted windows barreling down the road at breakneck speeds, swerving this way and that as a drunk girl stood through the sunroof, hooting and hollering like a maniac. "Ella!" I screamed, pointing. The driver slammed on the brakes and came to a screeching halt. Without thinking, I leaped out of the car and started running toward Ella. Everything moved in slow motion. I found myself running faster than I ever had before. I lunged into the street, my arms outstretched for Ella as she stood frozen in the middle of the crosswalk, just as the sports car was headed directly for her. I felt an impact. I shut my eyes as my body slammed into Ella's, and together we tumbled to the other side of the street. I opened my eyes, panting, and looked down at Ella in my arms. We were safe. Somehow I had managed to get both of us out of the way of the speeding sports car, which continued to careen down the city street as though they hadn't just been about to hit a little girl. "Mina, was it you?" "Yeah, I tried." It took Mina a while to answer, and she seemed to be so exhausted. That was incredible. Our driver came running as passers-by stood murmuring to each other on the sidewalk, pulling out their phones to snap pictures. "Are you two all right?" the driver asked, helping me stand as I held the crying Ella in my arms. Without a word, as I was too stunned and relieved to speak, I nodded and followed him back to the car. Edric was furious when we got back to the penthouse. He came running into the lobby as we arrived and ripped Ella out of my arms, who only cried harder. "You should have stayed there for the duration of her training," he shouted in front of the lobby staff. "I should fire you on the spot." Ella's wails grew in volume as tears streamed down my own cheeks. "I'm sorry, Edric," I sobbed. "I didn't know." "Please don't be mad at Moana," Ella cried, wrapping her small arms around her father's neck and tugging on him. "It wasn't her fault. I didn't listen and I left. I got lost. But then Moana came and saved me like a superhero." Edric's icy stare softened at his daughter's words, but I could tell that he was still furious, as he had every right to be after his daughter almost got kidnapped. Once we were back upstairs in the penthouse and Ella was passed out asleep in bed after the ordeal, I hesitantly walked over to Edric's study as I feared the worst. If he was going to yell at me again like he did in the lobby, I considered quitting. It was an honest mistake, and I thought that I at least deserved to be treated with some basic decency, since the situation had turned out all right in the long run. "Where did you go?" he snarled through his teeth when I entered the study. "Why weren't you there when she was finished with training?" "I went to the orphanage," I admitted quietly, omitting the complete reason why I was there. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to visit, and I thought Ella would be safe." Edric raised an eyebrow. "The orphanage?" I nodded. "I grew up there," I responded. "I like to visit the children sometimes." Edric was silent for a few moments before responding. "Don't let it happen again." His voice was cold, but at least he wasn't yelling at me any longer. "If you are going to the orphanage again, make sure Ella has someone with her." I nodded, a little surprised by how Edric became forgiving. "I will." "I'm so sorry, Edric." Edric said nothing else. I watched as he silently turned his back to me, and took that as my cue to leave. As I left the study, I felt hot tears prick at the backs of my eyes, but at the same time, I was just relieved to have found Ella in time, and that I still had my job, Moana. Despite everything that happened that day, Edric still requested that I spend the night with him. I made sure to put more distance between us this time, hoping that we wouldn't wake up in each other's arms again in the morning. When I woke up, my cardigan was still on, and Edric's side of the bed was empty. I heard the shower running in the bathroom, so I let out a sigh of relief and took it as my chance to get up and leave the room before I would have to talk to him. Not only was it still awkward to look him in the eye with our new arrangement, but I was admittedly still a little upset with him for yelling at me publicly the day before. I quickly got up and made the bed, opening the curtains out of habit to let some sunlight into the room before I put my slippers on and headed out. "Moana?" Ella's little voice said the second I walked out of the room. It made me jump a bit. I wasn't expecting her to be standing right outside the door. "Good morning, Miss Ella," I said, managing a smile. "Are you feeling better today?" Ella nodded, but her eyebrows were scrunched together and her eyes were narrowed suspiciously. "What were you doing in my daddy's room again?" I stammered, realizing that I couldn't use the crepes for breakfast excuse 2 days in a row. "Good morning, Princess," Edric said from behind me, brushing past me to scoop Ella up off the floor. Her look of concern and confusion quickly turned into a wide grin. "Daddy!" Ella exclaimed, giggling as Edric blew a raspberry on her cheek. "Where are you taking me for my birthday?" I let out a sigh of relief to know that Ella seemed to have completely forgotten about seeing me coming out of her father's room. I had also forgotten that today was her birthday. It had been mentioned in the packet of instructions given to me on my first day, but I had admittedly been too busy to look at it too closely since then. "Well, Princess," Edric said, carrying Ella toward the dining room for breakfast, his muscles bulging through his white button-down shirt and his hair still a bit damp at the ends from his shower. "Daddy has to work today." Ella's smile faded and she began to pout. "On my birthday? I know, sweetheart," Edric replied, "but Moana will do something fun with you today, and I'll be home later to have dinner and give you your presents." "And cake?" Ella asked. "And cake," Edric replied. After Edric left that morning, Ella was, unsurprisingly, quite sad that her father couldn't spend her birthday with her, so I tried to come up with something fun to do that would lift her spirits. "How about we play a game?" I asked, to which the little girl shook her head and folded her arm across her chest, sticking her lower lip out in a pout. I sighed, trying to think of something else, but every option I offered her was met with indignant refusal. I knew she just wanted to spend the day with Edric, and nothing would really make up for that. Finally, I resorted to looking at some local attractions on my phone. Although Selena and the maids were nervous about what happened before, they did finally concede to Ella's begging and told me that I could take her out so long as I stayed with her the entire time and didn't let go of her hand for 1 second, which was understandable. I knew that Selena still didn't trust me, but when I suggested going to a theme park for her birthday, Ella was too excited for even Selena to say no to the outing. "The driver will take you there," Selena said to me as I put Ella's sun hat on to protect her face. "And the bodyguard will be watching at all times. Don't lose her again." "I wasn't planning on it," I replied with a sigh, feeling a little annoyed at the housekeeper's blatant mistrust of me. I knew I messed up royally by leaving Ella's training to visit the orphanage when I should have been keeping an eye on her, but I wanted to prove to everyone and myself that I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Selena shot me a worried look as I got on the elevator with Ella, and I was relieved to see her face disappear as the metal doors closed. Now I could just focus on giving Ella a nice birthday. "Have you ever been to the theme park?" I asked Ella as we watched the floors on the elevator slowly tick down. Ella shook her head, which made the big blue bow on the back of her sun hat wiggle adorably. "Nope," she replied, sticking her foot out to admire her brand-new matching blue sandals. She clearly liked the color blue, as I was quickly learning. "I don't really get to go anywhere except for special occasions and to my training." I frowned, imagining what it would be like to be a little girl who wasn't allowed to go anywhere. Even growing up in the orphanage, Sophia took us on the occasional field trip or ice cream outing. We even went to the local swimming pool twice a month in the summer. "How come?" I asked. "Daddy says it's too risky," she replied, practically dragging me across the lobby as soon as the elevator doors opened. "He says that too many people will know who he is, so he has to stay hidden, because of the paparazzi?" I asked, stifling a laugh at Ella's childish language. Ella nodded her head affirmatively, appearing very serious. "Yes, that," she said. We left the building and climbed into the back of the town car where our driver waited for us, and the bodyguard shut the door behind us before getting into the passenger seat. The driver took us to the theme park and bought our tickets, and soon Ella was bursting with excitement as we looked around. Getting off from the roller coaster the second time, I started to feel sick, and it was broiling hot outside in the summer sun, so hot that I had resorted to fanning myself with a pamphlet I picked up at the information booth. But Ella hardly seemed to notice the heat and my sickness, as she was too excited about all of the rides. "Hey," I said finally, spotting an ice cream stand. "How about some ice cream first?" Ella stopped in her tracks suddenly and squealed excitedly before running off toward the ice cream stand, pulling me along behind her with surprising strength for a little girl. We stopped at the ice cream stand, and the man in a striped red and white uniform and a straw boater hat smiled down at her. "What would you like, little girl?" he asked. "Vanilla, please," Ella said. The man looked at me next. "I'll have the same," I replied. Ella waited patiently while the man got her ice cream, sticking her grabby little hands out greedily as he handed it to her and immediately starting to lick it as it was already beginning to melt. "That'll be $5, he said, looking at me expectantly. I smiled and patted my pocket, my eyes widening as I realized that I had completely forgotten to bring any money with me. In fact, it had been so long since I had needed any money of my own that I didn't even have any, and would have to ask the driver to spare me some cash until I got my first paycheck and could pay him back. "Oh," I murmured, "I'm so sorry. I left my wallet in the car. I'll be right back. Is that okay?" The man narrowed his eyes and gave me an icy stare. "I've heard that trick 1,000 times, lady," he growled, his sunny demeanor quickly turning sour. I stammered as I tried to explain that I really did have money. I just had to get my wallet, but was quickly interrupted by a familiar voice coming from behind me. "I'll pay," the voice said. Ella and I both turned around to see Edric standing behind us with his face covered by sunglasses and a surgical mask, holding out his credit card. "Moana, I'll pay." Ella and I were both shocked when we turned around to see Edric standing there, credit card in hand, his face covered by sunglasses and a surgical mask. "Daddy!" Ella exclaimed. Edric handed the ice cream salesman his credit card and ruffled Ella's hair. "Eat your ice cream before it melts," he said, guiding us away from the stand and the people behind us who were getting quickly annoyed at us for holding up the line to get ice cream. "I thought you had to work," Ella said. "I decided to come home early so I could spend your birthday with you after all," Edric replied. "But you weren't home. Selena told me that you went on an outing." I couldn't see his eyes through his sunglasses, but the way his head slowly turned toward me told me everything I needed to know. I felt my shoulders droop and looked embarrassingly down at my rapidly melting ice cream. We approached a bench, and Edric instructed Ella to sit while she finished her ice cream. Then he stood next to me and lowered his voice while she happily swung her legs and got ice cream all over her face. "Why did you take her out if you had no money?" he asked, his voice sounding cold and annoyed. "It was an honest mistake," I replied. "I haven't had to take out money in a while. And besides, the driver is close. It would have only taken a minute for him to pass me the money." Edric shook his head and said nothing else. Ella, who had been listening the entire time, suddenly jumped up from her bench. "This is the best birthday ever," she said very quickly. "Please, I want to stay." It seemed that Ella was afraid that her father would make her go home, and Edric's next words made my heart sink. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said. "It's really not safe for us to be out in public." Ella stuck her lower lip out in a pout. "But it's my birthday," she whined. "You never want to go anywhere, and I'm having fun here with Moana." "She's a little girl, Edric," I said quietly. "Let her enjoy her birthday, and please, join us." Edric was silent for a few moments before letting out a deep sigh and crouching to wipe the ice cream off of Ella's face with a napkin. "All right," he said. "We'll stay." Ella squealed in delight and, taking both of our hands, began to drag us around the theme park with just as much, if not more, fervor as she had when it was just the two of us. As we spent the afternoon walking around the theme park, I couldn't help but take out my phone to secretly snap some sweet pictures of Ella and Edric together. It was so sweet watching them play games together and seeing Ella sitting on Edric's shoulders while we walked that I couldn't help myself. Edric didn't seem to mind the photos either, although I wondered why he was so adamant on keeping his mask on. Would he really want to look back at photos with his daughter and see that his face was covered for all of them? As the sun started to get down, Edric and I began to feel tired. Ella, however, still had just as much energy and insisted on one more ride before we went home. I suggested the Ferris wheel because it was slow and relaxing, and both of them agreed. We climbed into the basket on the Ferris wheel. Edric sat across from me with Ella on his lap. As we started to go up, now that we were safe from prying eyes, Edric took off his sunglasses to reveal steely gray eyes that appeared surprisingly happy for the first time since I had met him. Maybe the alpha billionaire needed a fun outing just as much as his daughter did. As we rose up above the theme park under the setting sun, an involuntary gasp came out of my mouth. The way that the last rays of sunlight refracted across the treetops as they swayed in the hot summer breeze, and the way that the string lights lit up the park below us made the city feel even more dazzling than before. Not only that, but the breeze ruffled through my hair and cooled the sweat on my hot skin. I looked across from me to see Ella giggling and peering out over the crowd, and behind her, her father wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at me. His eyes darted away quickly, as though he had only glanced at me on accident. Soon, the Ferris wheel began to roll us back downward, lowering us back into the crowd. The Ferris wheel went around a few times more. When it finally came to a stop at the bottom, the attendant let us out. Edric put his mask back on, then got out with Ella in one of his arms. Then he turned around and held out his other hand for me to help me out. My blush deepened as I felt his cool palm, but we both quickly pulled away when Ella looked at us. "All right, princess," Edric said as we walked away from the Ferris wheel. He set her down and crouched down to her level. "I think we've had enough fun for one day. Are you ready to go home?" Ella nodded, although she looked a little disappointed. I remembered being that age still. I would have wanted to spend my entire life running around theme parks when I was a little girl. We started to head back to where the driver was waiting. As we did, one of the theme park staff, a teenage girl wearing a screen-printed t-shirt that had the theme park logo on it, khaki shorts, and a long brown ponytail, came up to us with a smile and a flyer in her hands. "Hi, folks," she said, holding the flyer out. "We're hosting a special family event tonight with prizes. Would you like to participate?" Ella quickly snatched the flyer away, her face lighting up at the concept of prizes. Edric and I, shooting each other a tired glance, leaned down to look at the flyer over Ella's shoulder. The prizes were limited edition dolls. I remembered seeing a collection of some of those very same dolls in Ella's room at the penthouse. But the catch was that 2 parents had to participate in the event, which meant that we were technically not supposed to play. Edric, seemingly noticing the same detail I did, stood and looked at the girl. "Is there any way to just purchase one of the dolls?" he asked. The teenage girl shook her head, making her ponytail swing back and forth. "I'm sorry," she said. "We're not allowed to sell any prizes. If you want one of the dolls, you have to participate with 2 parents." Ella turned around and pouted, tugging on both of our heartstrings, as she looked back and forth between the 2 of us. Edric opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a mischievous look came over the little girl's face. She whipped back around to face the staff member and took both of our hands again, holding them up triumphantly. "My parents and I will play." "Edric." Moana and I both shot each other a somewhat annoyed glance as Ella decided, against our wills, to volunteer us to participate in the game as her parents. I didn't know how to explain to the staff member standing in front of us that Moana was just Ella's au pair, not her mother, and we were certainly not married, nor would we ever be. The teenage staff member looked back and forth between Moana and I with a somewhat disbelieving expression on her face. I knew she could tell that Moana was human and I was a werewolf, but thankfully she didn't say anything. "Right this way," the girl said, stepping out of the way and gesturing toward the center of the park, where a group of parents and children had gathered in front of a gazebo with a small stage. Moana and I followed reluctantly, Ella tugging on our hands with even more excitement than she had all day, if that was even possible. As we approached the crowd, we started to get some strange looks from other parents. I was still wearing my mask, so my identity as one of the world's most famous alpha CEOs was still hidden, but I knew that people could tell there was something off about our pairing. I was still wearing my work clothes, a sleek white button-up shirt with the collar partially undone and the sleeves rolled up from the summer heat, a pair of tan trousers that had been freshly pressed, and my hair was well groomed, but Moana appeared rather plain next to me. She was a pretty woman, but wore a plain linen dress and sandals. I hadn't quite gotten around to taking her shopping yet for some new clothes that would be more appropriate for an au pair of a wealthy family, although if I was being honest, I wasn't quite sure if she would have accepted my generosity anyway. What was even more jarring for the other parents, aside from our differences in appearance, was that Moana was human and I was a werewolf. It was extremely rare for a married couple to have such differences, and it was often frowned upon. I was just glad that my identity was hidden, because as attractive as I found Moana, I didn't want people thinking that I, Edric Morgan, was married to a human. Regardless of the discomfort, we made our way to the waiting area and stood along with all of the other families. While most people gave us snide looks and pulled their children away, there were, surprisingly, a couple of women who approached Moana with warm smiles. "My, what a lovely couple," one woman exclaimed, making Moana's face turn red. "And what a cute little girl." She stooped down to Ella's height and pinched her cheek, which made Ella giggle. The woman stood then and eyed me up and down before turning back to Moana and whispering something to her that made Moana's face turn even more red than it was before. Moana glanced over her shoulder at me with a sheepish look in her eyes for a split second before turning back to the woman, muttering a word of thanks, and staring embarrassingly at the ground with wide eyes as the woman walked back to join her family. "What did she say to you?" I asked quietly, leaning a bit closer to Moana. She cleared her throat, obviously seeming embarrassed by the entire interaction. "She congratulated me on having such a handsome husband and a cute daughter," she said. Below us, Ella looked up with a mischievous look in her eyes and put her hand over her mouth, stifling laughter. At some point, I would have to give my daughter a talking to about how rude it was to put Moana and I in a situation like this, but I simply couldn't bring myself to disappoint her on her birthday, so I would play along with it for now. Ella was right about her birthdays. I hadn't exactly been the best father because I was so afraid of our identities being discovered by the paparazzi in public. But it wasn't fair for me to make my daughter miss out on her birthday just because of my own nerves. The game announcer stepped up on stage then and cleared his throat into the microphone, quieting the small crowd and breaking me out of my deep thought. "Good evening, ladies and gents," he said with a plastic smile as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for participating in our family event tonight. I hope you all have fun as you compete to win prizes." The children in the crowd began to stir excitedly as one of the staff members pulled a sheet off of a table with a flourish. Ella gasped as the grand prize was revealed to be an extremely rare doll that she didn't yet have in her collection. There were other prizes as well, but I could tell already that she was going to be hell-bent on winning that grand prize. "For tonight's game, you will all be trying to find your way through a maze," the announcer said. "But not just any maze. One parent from each couple will volunteer to stand at various pre-assigned points throughout the maze, while the other parent will be tasked with finding them." This sounds easy enough, I thought to myself. "But there's a catch," the announcer continued, holding up a small black blindfold. "Both parents will be blindfolded. It will be the child's job to use their mind link to guide their searching parent to the waiting parent, as well as the searching parent's job to use their child's advice and their own sense of smell to find their partner." "Ooh, how fun," the woman from before said, clasping her hands together. I looked over at her to see her casting an almost condescending glance at Moana. She certainly knew that Moana was a human. This game was clearly geared solely toward werewolves, which put us at a major disadvantage. I let out a small sigh as I looked down at my excited daughter. If we didn't win, I would definitely have to figure out a way to buy her that doll, or she would never forgive me. Staff members came around and handed out blindfolds next, while other staff members guided the children toward a tall platform that allowed them to look down into the hedge maze. "I guess I'll be the one to hide," Moana said, looking a little embarrassed. I nodded and watched her follow the attendant that was leading the waiting parents to their hiding spots, then watched as she disappeared in the maze. "Now," the attendant said after a couple of minutes, once all of the parents were hidden, "if all of the seekers could line up, we will begin. And please, put on your blindfolds." I got into place and glanced up at Ella one last time, who shot me a grin and a thumbs up before I put my blindfold on. "On your marks. Get set. Go." "Go forward," Ella said immediately using our mind link. "Now left, now right." Unsurprisingly, Ella seemed to have already studied the maze thoroughly before we even started, and I realized that it was thanks to her amazing intelligence that I was actually getting a lead on the rest of the parents. She guided me through the maze with ease, as though she had done this a million times before. "You're almost there. Just one more turn to the right." I turned right, keeping one hand on the hedge to guide myself. "She's there, Daddy. Just go forward." As I groped my way forward, I felt a strange scent fill my senses. It was faint, but it was there, right in front of me. A sweet, pleasant smell that made my wolf perk up suddenly. This couldn't be Moana. She had no scent as a human. But as we lifted our blindfolds, it was indeed Moana. Edric, I lifted my blindfold, as did she. The sweet scent that I smelled was definitely Moana, or so I thought. It faded so quickly that I was no longer sure if it was her who I smelled, or someone else. It couldn't be her anyway. She was a human. She had no scent. "It looks like we have our first winners," the announcer called over the microphone. As Ella squealed with delight on the platform above, I realized that I was holding Moana's hand. I saw her blushing, and I quickly dropped her hand. When we re-emerged from the maze, Ella was standing at the entrance with one of the staff members, the same girl from before. The staff member gave Moana and I a strange look, but still said nothing, and instead handed Ella the grand prize, the rare doll that Ella had so desperately wanted. As we walked back to the car, Ella couldn't stop chattering about how much she loved her doll, how amazing it was that she was able to make me find Moana so quickly, and how this was the best birthday she had ever had in her entire life. The driver was waiting for us by the theme park entrance and looked a little relieved to finally be able to go home after waiting all day. Once we were in the car, I finally took my mask off, breathing deeply and rubbing the backs of my sore ears from wearing it all day. The driver pulled away from the curb and started taking us in the direction of the penthouse, where, unbeknownst to both Ella and Moana, I had arranged for Selena and the maids to prepare a beautiful dinner with a special cake for Ella's birthday. For the entire duration of the ride home, Ella sat next to Moana with her new doll clutched tightly to her chest, humming and wiggling happily in her seat. I couldn't help myself from sneaking a glance at Moana every so often, who didn't seem to notice me looking at her as she focused solely on Ella. "You did just a good job, Miss Smarty Pants," Moana said, wrapping her arm around Ella's small shoulders. "What are you going to name your doll?" Ella thought to herself with furrowed brows for a few moments, tapping her chin with her index finger. "I think I'll name her Momo. It's almost like Moana." I stifled a chuckle as Moana's face turned red, but as I watched them, my mind wandered back to the strange scent I had picked up in the maze. I decided to ask my wolf if he had any sort of explanation. "Were you able to recognize where that scent came from?" I asked my wolf. "No," he replied. "It was too quick and faint, although I think it might have been a potential mate." I furrowed my brow as I looked away from Moana and Ella and looked out the window instead at the city sights as they passed by. Was my mate at the theme park, and I somehow missed them? After dinner, Moana put Ella to bed. Moana came to my room a little while later, due to our agreement, still bundled up in extra layers, of course, as if I would touch her against her will, and shot me a wary look as she shut the door behind herself. I was sitting on the bed, reading when she entered. "Sorry," she said. "I can wait a while." "It's fine," I replied. "I'm ready to sleep." Even though we had only been sleeping together as part of our arrangement for a few days now, I was already feeling immensely better. I thought to myself that the insomnia was just caused by being lonely in bed, but then I would think about other one-night stands I had before Moana came into the picture, and would remember that, even then, I would never sleep without pills or alcohol. What was it about Moana that helped me sleep? There wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary with her, and her demeanor was often cordial with me. She was even a little cold with me sometimes, whereas I had had previous one-night stands with women who were head over heels for me. Maybe there was just something comforting about Moana. She was exceptionally good with children, after all, as I discovered from watching how naturally she handled Ella. She seemed like the nurturing sort. Maybe nurturing was what I needed to fall asleep. Moana slowly came around to the opposite side of the bed, pausing to glance at the window. "Do you want the curtains closed?" she asked, pointing. I said, looking at where she was pointing. "Oh, no, it's fine." I had completely forgotten about how she had opened the curtains after our second night of sleeping together. Normally, I like to keep the room as dark as possible to try and help me sleep, but it didn't seem to be bothering me now. Besides, the fresh air coming through the window felt nice on the hot summer night. Moana took out her earrings and placed them on the side table, then pulled the blankets back and climbed into bed next to me. She performed her usual ritual of stuffing a pillow between us and scooching all the way over to the edge of the king-sized mattress, leaving a space between us that was practically the size of the Atlantic Ocean, then promptly turned away and put her head on the pillow. Sighing, I shut off the lamp and laid down myself. My eyes stayed open, however, slowly adjusting to the moonlit room, as I continued to wonder about the scent I had picked up earlier, as well as Moana's strange ability to induce sleep for me. I remembered then that Moana had gone to the orphanage the day before when Ella was nearly lost. Had she truly gone just to visit? When I had asked before, she seemed a bit pensive about it, like she wasn't telling me everything. "You went to the orphanage yesterday, right?" I asked suddenly as I stared at the ceiling, unable to contain my curiosity. Moana paused for a moment before replying with a simple, "Do you mind if I ask why?" "I already told you," she answered. "I like to visit the children there sometimes." My werewolf sixth sense told me that she was still not telling the whole truth, but I didn't pry anymore. Besides, Moana must have fallen asleep already, because I suddenly found myself slipping into sleep as well. As sleep slowly pulled me into its clutches, I began to dream of mazes and a sweet, faint smell, Moana. When I woke up the morning after Ella's birthday, I was shocked to discover that it was already 11 o'clock. 3 hours past my usual time to wake up in the morning. If it hadn't been for my phone buzzing on the bedside table, I likely would have slept in for even longer. As I awoke, squinting against the bright sunlight coming in through the large window, I also discovered something else. Edric and I were cuddling again. Feeling my face flush hot, I quickly climbed out of bed, taking care not to wake Edric, and picked up my phone to see Selena's name on my screen. "Selena?" I said quietly, walking away from the bed so as not to wake the still sleeping Edric. "Where on earth are you?" she asked angrily, her voice quivering with rage. "You should have been up hours ago, and you haven't answered even though I've been knocking on your door all morning." I gulped, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over me. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse as the housekeeper was still oblivious to my new sleeping arrangement with Edric, and she certainly wouldn't understand it if I tried to explain it to her myself. I was taking a shower just now. I'll be out soon." Selena grumbled on the other end of the phone. "Well, hurry up. We have guests who are expecting you, Ella, and Mr. Morgan downstairs in the lobby as soon as possible." Before I could answer, Selena abruptly hung up the phone. It was at this point as well that Edric sat up in bed, wide awake. Had I been talking so loudly that I woke him up? It always seemed that he fell asleep as soon as I did, and woke up as soon as I woke up, which was strange, but I didn't have time to think about it. "Did I hear something about guests?" Edric said confusedly as I slid my feet into my slippers and shuffled off toward the door. "Yes," I replied, quickly opening the door and poking my head out to make sure no one was around. I'm not sure who, though. Seeing that no one was around, I quickly ran out of Edric's bedroom and scurried off to my room, somehow managing to slip inside without being seen. I washed myself up, still groggy and sore from spending my entire day yesterday at the theme park, with a sunburn across my nose to prove it, and then got dressed in clean clothes. I pulled my hair back into a low bun, and once I was satisfied with my appearance, I opened the door to my bedroom and quickly got Ella ready for our visitors. By the time I was finished getting Ella ready, Edric was already waiting for us in the foyer. We took the elevator down to the lobby to greet these mystery guests. I hid my bashfulness around Edric in the silent elevator as best I could and avoided eye contact at all costs, as it seemed that we would wake up cuddling every morning despite our agreement to not get romantically involved, and I didn't want him to think that I was trying to break the clauses in my contract, nor did I want to alert Ella, Selena, or the maids to our arrangement. The elevator slowly ticked down the floors of the high-rise building, finally opening with a ding at the ground floor. "Grandma," Ella called when we saw our guests standing in the lobby. I was taken by surprise as Ella ran away excitedly to greet them. As we approached, the two guests came into focus. One was an older woman with silver hair wearing an expensive-looking dress and a large sun hat, while the other was much younger with an equally expensive-looking satin dress and perfectly curled blonde hair that fell down her back, her eyes covered by large sunglasses. "Oh, hello, darling," the older woman said, bending down to kiss Ella on both cheeks. "Happy belated birthday. Grandma has lots of presents for you." Ella squealed delightedly. Both women looked up as Edric and I approached, eyeing me up and down suspiciously. "Say hello to Kelly, Ella," Edric said. Ella reluctantly turned toward the younger woman, who pushed her sunglasses up onto her forehead to reveal dark brown eyes that stared at me icily for a split second before looking down at Ella. "Hello, Kelly," Ella said, sounding much less enthusiastic than she did when she greeted her grandmother. Kelly bent down and kissed Ella on both cheeks, who stiffened at the young woman's touch, and stepped back toward me once Kelly stood again. The two women continued to eye me, so I decided to end the awkward silence and introduce myself. "I'm Moana," I said with a slight polite bow of my head. "I'm Ella's nanny." "Ah, the au pair," Verona said coldly. I didn't expect a human, so I was unsure. "Mother," Edric said, stepping forward to kiss her on both cheeks. He then turned toward Kelly, who beamed widely at him, but she glared at me coldly over his shoulder as they kissed each other on the cheek. Edric took the two women's bags and carried them to the elevator. We all stood quietly in the elevator as it slowly carried us up to the penthouse. Suddenly, Kelly turned toward me, looking down her nose at me. "So, do you have the right qualifications to be Ella's au pair?" "Pardon me?" I asked, feeling as though Kelly was being rude. "I only ask because I care deeply about Ella," she said with a stiff smile. "Sometimes I feel as though Ella is my own daughter." "Ella is the best nanny ever," Ella chimed in. When I looked down at her, she was frowning up at Kelly with an angry glint in her eyes. Kelly merely nodded, not saying anything else. Thankfully, the doors opened, and the two women became too distracted by the penthouse and ordering the servants around to disturb me any longer, which was a relief. Edric led Verona and Kelly to the dining room, with Ella trailing behind miserably. Selena beckoned for me to help her in the kitchen. Just before I lost sight of the group, I noticed Kelly attempting to talk to Ella, who was acting aloof and disinterested. "Is Kelly Edric's sister?" I asked Amy quietly as we worked side by side to prepare lunch. Amy shook her head. "No," she replied. I saw movement from the corner of my eye and looked over my shoulder to see Edric passing by the doorway with Kelly on his heels. She appeared to be following him, chattering away about something. They looked to be headed in the direction of Edric's bedroom. "A friend, then?" I asked. Amy smirked. I think if Ella wasn't around, Kelly would already be Edric's wife by now. Selena shot Amy a disapproving look, abruptly ending the conversation. Even though I knew that I wasn't supposed to have any sort of feelings toward Edric, there was no denying the pit in my stomach as Amy told me this. Was Kelly Edric's girlfriend or fiancée? Moana. I finished preparing lunch with the maids and helped them to set the meal out on the dining room table. Although I had already eaten a quick meal in the kitchen earlier as we prepared the food, It was still my duty as Ella's nanny to stay with her and help her if she needed anything. Besides, the grumpy look on Ella's face whenever Kelly was around only softened when I was near her, which made me want to be near her even more as support. I sat beside Ella for the duration of the lunch, helping her to cut her food, keep her clothes clean, and get her whatever she needed. Edric, Verona, and Kelly spoke with each other about trivial things as though I wasn't even there, which was fine with me. If they had tried to involve me in their conversation, I likely wouldn't have known the right things to say. I'd never dealt with such wealthy people in my life, let alone tried to have meaningful conversation with them. Not being personally involved in the conversation also allowed me to be more observant, and one thing that I observed was that Kelly was being much more quiet and reserved now than she had been before. She absent-mindedly picked at her salad with her fork, hardly eating anything at all. "Pour me some more tea, would you?" Kelly said suddenly, shooting me a look out of the corner of her eyes. "Right away," I said, standing and walking around the table to pick up the teapot. I noticed that Kelly kept her eyes intensely focused on me the entire time as I walked back to pour her tea, but I pretended that I didn't see it. Kelly was silent for a moment as I poured her tea. I felt her gaze focused on the side of my head, burning furiously. When I sat down, Kelly took a sip of her tea before speaking again, this time looking at Edric. "Whose extra daily necessities were in your room earlier, Edric?" she asked, setting down her teacup with a clatter. Edric raised an eyebrow. "Pardon?" "I saw earrings on your side table," she said. "I'm assuming they weren't yours." Verona let out a small gasp and instinctively looked at me. I felt my heart jump up into my throat, resisting the urge to feel my ears to see if I had put my earrings in that morning. As a knot formed in my stomach, I glanced down at my own tea to see in my reflection that I had not, in fact, put my earrings back in. "Earrings?" Edric replied after an uncomfortable pause, sounding so nonchalant it made my stomach sick. "I'm not sure. Sometimes Ella likes to play in there." Ella slowly turned her head to look up at me, but said nothing. There was another long silence. I started to wonder if they all knew, and that Kelly would call Edric out on his bluff and expose our unexplainable sleeping arrangement. Thankfully, she didn't say anything else about it. Surprisingly, Kelly seemed somewhat pleased by Edric's words and didn't ask again. "Edric," Kelly said after a few more moments of silence, turning toward him in her seat. "Do you remember when we were kids and we used to drive our training coaches insane? We used to run off into the woods as wolves together and play instead of attending our training." "I do remember," Edric replied, almost absent-mindedly, as he cut his food with his fork and knife. Kelly turned back to face me and Ella. "I'm sure you misbehave all of the time for your trainers, don't you?" she said, reaching out to pinch Ella's cheek. Ella frowned and pulled away. "Actually, I always do my training," she said, her little voice flat and cold. With a slight humph, Kelly returned to picking at her salad. As the luncheon continued, I couldn't help but feel guilty for my arrangement with Edric after hearing about how he and his childhood sweetheart used to act together. It felt wrong of me to be participating in this agreement if he had love for Kelly. And for some reason, hearing about Edric's escapades with his childhood lover made me admittedly feel incredibly unhappy. After lunch, Verona and Kelly stayed for a while. Ella seemed to get sleepy, although I suspected that she just wanted an excuse to be alone. So I took her to her room. When I finished tucking her in for her nap, I returned to the foyer to see Verona and Kelly preparing to leave. Verona and Edric were talking quietly about something that seemed important, so I turned away to go to the kitchen and give them space. "Ah, there she is," Verona said when she saw me, waving me over before I could walk away. I still felt Kelly's cold gaze on me as I tentatively walked up to Edric's mother. Verona, much unlike Kelly, was smiling a bit and seemed a little more open to my presence than the young woman. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Morgan," I said politely as I approached. "And you as well, Kelly." Kelly seemed to open her mouth to say something, but Verona spoke before she could. "I was just reminding my son about our upcoming annual family dinner," Verona said. "It seems he's forgotten, or he just thought he could get out of going this year." Her eyes slid over to Edric for a moment, who didn't seem to react at all. Anyway, Verona continued, looking at me again, of course, little Miss Ella's presence is always appreciated at these dinners. So, I thought it would only be appropriate to invite you as well. The dinners are usually reserved for werewolves, but seeing as you're Ella's au pair, it simply wouldn't feel right to exclude you. Miss Ella seems quite attached to you already, and she'll need you there to help her if she should need it. I was a bit taken aback by Edric's mother's generosity and respect. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan, I said with a polite smile. I'll look forward to it. Verona smiled stiffly, but cordially, and turned back toward Edric. She reached out and squeezed his forearm, pulling him aside to speak to him privately. While they were absorbed in whatever conversation they were having, Kelly quietly sauntered up to me and stood beside me. "Give me your hand," she said coldly. Swallowing, I did as I was told. I felt my heart drop as she held out her hand and dropped my earrings that she had found on Edric's nightstand into my palm, then leaned toward me and whispered into my ear, "Know your place." Edric and Verona finished their conversation and returned just as I closed my hand around the earrings, my eyes wide. "I'll see you soon, darling," Verona said to Edric as the elevator doors slid open. I felt so shocked by Kelly's words that I continued to stand there, motionless, as the two women got onto the elevator. The last thing I saw before the elevator doors closed was Kelly's icy stare, fixed on me. As I discreetly slipped my earrings into my pocket, I knew that I couldn't continue my sleeping arrangement with Edric. Not when he had a girlfriend, Moana. I decided not to go to Edric's room that night. I couldn't bring myself to do it in good conscience after discovering that he had a girlfriend, and I wasn't about to be his mistress on top of being his daughter's nanny. At the usual time that I normally would have been sneaking over to Edric's room, I instead crawled into my own bed with my sketchbook for the first time in days. It felt a bit strange already to be sleeping alone, but it was also a relief from all of the stress of our strange agreement, and it was nice to have the late night to myself to have some time to draw. Like clockwork, however, my phone started to ring just 5 minutes after I picked up my pencil. I lifted my eyes from my sketchbook, letting out a deep sigh when I was Edric's name on my screen. "Yes?" I said after picking up the phone. "Where are you?" Edric said. His voice sounded agitated. "I've decided to unilaterally end our sleeping arrangement," I replied. "You can reduce my salary back to the original amount. I'm sorry, but I'm no longer comfortable sleeping together." Edric was silent. I could hear him take in a sharp breath on the other side of the phone before he abruptly hung up. Rolling my eyes, I shut my phone off and tossed it down on my bed, returning to my drawing. A few minutes later, there was a knock on my door. No doubt it was Edric. I decided not to answer and to just pretend that I was asleep, which seemed to work as he didn't knock again, or so I thought. He knocked again, this time louder. I set my sketchbook aside and pondered whether I should let him in or not, but finally jumped up out of bed and scurried over to the door when he knocked for a third time, even louder and more aggressively that time. "Can you not try to wake everyone up?" I asked in a hushed tone of voice as I opened the door. Without a response, Edric brushed past me with an angry look on his face. Sighing, I quietly shut the door behind him and turned to face him with my arms folded across my chest. It was then that I realized I was only wearing my nightgown, thanks to Edric's glance down at my bare legs. I quickly grabbed my robe off of the back of my chair and put it on, pulling it tightly around myself. "What's going on?" Edric asked, quickly looking away from my body. "You seemed fine with our arrangement. What changed so quickly? Don't tell me you suddenly found your dignity again." I sighed and looked down at the floor, not entirely sure how to best phrase it. Finally, I looked back up to face Edric, who was staring at me again with an agitated expression. "I did find my dignity again," I said, "and I never should have made this agreement with you in the first place. I'm your daughter's nanny, not your sleeping buddy. Besides, if you have a girlfriend, you should be sleeping with her and not me. I didn't come here to be your mistress." Edric furrowed his brow and shot me a puzzled look. "What?" he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "What do you mean?" "Kelly found the earrings I left on your bedside table," I said. "I'm afraid she misunderstood our relationship." Edric was silent for several moments before shaking his head. You think Kelly is my girlfriend? I cocked my head, suddenly feeling confused. Surely you two would have been married already, if not for Ella. You must have listened to the maids, Edric said, rolling his eyes and walking over to the balcony, staring out at the city below with his back turned to me for a few moments before turning back to face me. Kelly is my childhood friend. She's like a little sister to me. I've never thought about her in that sort of way. Our families are close, and we had the chance to be each other's chosen mates, but I decided against it. Yes, Ella also doesn't like her, but I chose myself not to be romantically involved with Kelly. I froze, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, I said finally. The way she spoke to you, I thought. Well, you thought wrong, Edric interrupted with a frown. Maybe you should talk to me next time before you go and gossip with the maids about my personal affairs. There was another long silence between us as I processed everything Edric had told me. My mind still raced as I thought about our arrangement. I guess I overreacted, but what if Edric really got a girlfriend in the future? Fine, I said, walking over to the edge of my bed and sitting down. If you want to continue the arrangement, we can, but under 2 conditions. Go on, Edric said reluctantly, folding his arms across his chest with narrowed eyes. For starters, I want to sleep in my own bed sometimes, I said. You can join me, or you can not join me, but I should be entitled to sleeping in my own bedroom a couple of nights a week, and the responsibility of hiding our arrangement shouldn't be entirely mine. I also want 1 night a week by myself. Edric paused for a few moments. I wondered if he would refuse, but finally he nodded. That's reasonable, he said, which gave me an immense amount of relief. What's the second condition? Or was sleeping alone the second condition? I shook my head and stared at the floor for the next few seconds as I tried to formulate my thoughts. Finally, I looked back up and bravely met the alpha billionaire's icy gray stare. If you start seeing a woman and she becomes your girlfriend, I want our arrangement to end immediately, I said. Especially if you plan on getting married. I won't have anyone questioning my relationship with you. Edric suddenly looked somewhat amused for a split second before answering with a surprisingly light and nonchalant tone of voice. That won't be a problem. I narrowed my eyes. What do you mean? I asked. I won't ever get married, Edric replied. I frowned, confused by this statement. What could possibly be stopping a wealthy, handsome alpha CEO from getting married? Before I had the chance to say anything else, however, Edric circled around to the other side of my bed. We'll sleep in here tonight, he said matter-of-factly, grabbing the blankets and pulling them down. He must not have seen my sketchbook laying there, because it toppled to the floor as he pulled the blankets down. He paused for a moment, then picked up my sketchbook. I suddenly felt my face flush hot as he looked at my drawings, and I went to snatch it out of his hand, but he quickly pulled away, shooting me another amused glance, as he looked at the drawing I had been working on before he rudely barged in. Is this Ella and me on the Ferris wheel? He asked, his smirk fading as he looked up at me. I grabbed the sketchbook out of his hands, then stuffed it in my bedside table drawer. Edric said nothing. Without a word, he climbed into bed and turned onto his side and went to sleep. Moana. The day of the Morgan family dinner banquet finally came. Selena informed me that anyone attending these banquets was expected to dress formally, so I found a nice dark blue dress with bows in Ella's closet and dressed her up with cute socks and shoes, then curled her hair and put a big bow in it. She seemed to have completely forgotten Kelly's rude comments at the luncheon the week before, and if she didn't forget, she at least didn't seem to let it bother her. Wow, my hair's so curly, Ella said, bobbing her head to make her curls bounce. Thank you, Moana. I smiled at the little girl in the mirror and squeezed her shoulders. All of a sudden, her gaze slipped over to my outfit, and her smile faded. Are you going to dress up? She asked. I looked down at my own outfit with a slight frown. I had chosen the nicest clothes I owned that were also appropriate for a nanny at a family gathering. A simple dress, low-heeled shoes, and no jewelry so as not to stand out too much. I thought I looked perfectly fine for my status, but now that Ella pointed it out, I felt incredibly plain. Oh, I'm just wearing this, I said with a shrug. Nonsense. I looked up to see Selena standing in the doorway. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she looked at me. shaking her head with her arms folded across her chest. "Is this inappropriate?" I asked Selena, stepping away from Ella to show my full outfit. Selena sighed. "It's fine, but you can wear something a little nicer. You're a pretty girl, but it makes you look homely." I blushed at the housekeeper's sudden kind words. She had never mentioned my appearance before, save for the night of the interview. She seemed a bit shocked herself when she finished speaking, and both of our faces turned a slight tinge of red. "Come," she said, quickly turning on her heel. "We'll take care of this. Hurry up, you haven't got all day." With that, Selena disappeared down the hall. I jogged after her, ignoring Ella's giggles. "Now let's see." I looked around confusedly, not knowing where Selena went, although I could hear her muttering to herself and the sounds of her digging through something. Too big, too showy. Aha! Selena suddenly emerged from a large closet in the hallway, holding a long dress. It was a dark emerald green color and had short flutter sleeves. "Here," she said, holding it out to me. "The green will complement your complexion and your hair." I took the dress. It felt like a light cotton material, perfect for the summer heat, but appeared luxurious. "Thank you," I said, holding the dress up to myself and turning to look in the hallway mirror. "Does this belong to one of the maids?" "It was mine when I was your age, actually," Selena said, taking me by surprise. When I looked at her, I noticed that her aging cheeks were a bit red, and she quickly averted her gaze. "I haven't worn it in years. You can keep it." Once again, I was taken aback by the grumpy old housekeeper's kindness. For a moment, I imagined her as a young woman wearing this dress and pictured her as being a beautiful young girl. I put on the dress in my room. It fit like a glove, and Selena was right. It suited my coloring perfectly and brought out the green in my eyes. Although it was a dress that was appropriate for a nanny, it was still a bit sexy and showed off my curves, and I was surprised that Selena would pick it for me. Next, Amy and Lily came into my room. They curled my hair and then pulled it back into a half bun before giving me minimal makeup with dark red lipstick that made me feel attractive. Once they were finished, I felt like an entirely new person. Edric was waiting in the lobby downstairs, so Ella and I quickly took the elevator down once I was ready. As the elevator doors opened and I emerged with Ella's hand in mine, Edric's eyes became transfixed on me for a fleeting moment. I felt my heart pulse suddenly as he looked at me, and for a brief moment, I felt Mina's presence inside of me, as though the way he looked at me made my wolf stir. Just as quickly as it began, however, it was over. Edric looked away, returning to his usual aloof self, and got into the car. The house where the party was held was a palace. It had hundreds of rooms, countless staff, and dozens of garden courtyards with fountains and marble sculptures. As we entered the foyer, I couldn't help but feel out of place in such an expensive mansion and wondered to myself how huge the Morgan family must have been for them to need such a massive home. Indeed, the Morgan family was enormous. Ella was immediately accosted by older aunts and uncles and cousins who all doted on her and who also barely paid me any attention, not that I minded, before we were even able to take our seats at the banquet table. "Come here, Ella." A male voice boomed above the rest. I looked up to see an older man standing beside Verona. Judging from the steely gray eyes and his tall, thin build, he was Edric's father. Ella, somewhat nervously, walked up to the old man. "Hello, Grandpa." On Verona's other side, just as I had worried, stood Kelly, and the way that her eyes widened when she saw me told me all that I needed to know. The banquet soon began, and I found myself seated between Ella and Kelly. Across from me sat Edric and Verona, with Edric's father. I discovered his name was Michael, sitting at the closest end of the long banquet table. The luxurious meal was served, consisting of roast duck and countless other dishes. "I don't like duck," Ella whispered into my ear, making a face at her plate. "It's all right," I responded with a gentle smile. "You can eat something else?" "So, tell me," Kelly suddenly chimed in, grabbing my attention as she swirled her wine around in her glass. "Is such a dress suitable for a nanny?" I was taken aback by the curt question and didn't know how to respond. Verona, however, heard Kelly's comment. "You look beautiful, darling," Verona said with a wink. "I'm so glad you were able to come. Aren't you, dear?" she said, turning to her husband. Michael slowly chewed his duck, eyeing me up and down for several painfully long moments before swallowing. "Humph," he said before promptly turning toward Edric. "Edric, have you found a mate yet?" Edric stared down at his plate. "No, father." "Well, the clock is ticking," the old man said, stabbing another piece of duck with his fork and waving it around a bit as he spoke. "It'll only be so long before the public finds out about your illegitimate child. People will ask questions, and it won't look good for the Weircorp image." Michael's backhanded comment caused the table to fall into silence. Beside me, Ella abruptly stood and pushed her chair back. I looked down at her to see tears rolling down her little cheeks, and before I could stop her, she stormed out. I tentatively slid my chair out. Verona, from across the table, cast me a subtle but approving nod, and I took that as my green light to follow Ella. As I searched for Ella, it occurred to me that Edric's cold and aloof demeanor must have come from his father. It was strange to me that Verona, who was such a sweet and warm woman, would have been married to such a brute for so many years. I eventually found Ella in the garden. She was sitting on a stone bench, swinging her legs with her hands folded in her lap as she looked down at the ground. "Can I sit with you?" I asked, to which she nodded. I sat and put my arm around Ella's shoulders. "Grown-ups are mean," she said finally after a few minutes. "They sure can be," I replied gently. "But when you grow up, you'll be nicer than they are, and that's all that matters." "Ahem. Moana?" a familiar voice said suddenly. Ella and I looked up. "Uncle Ethan," Ella said, jumping up and running to the man standing in front of us. Ethan Bradley, the famous artist and the kind man who I met at the orphanage, was secretly a part of the Morgan family.